Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, colleagues. Welcome. Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. We are about to start session 2 on the future of planning. Welcome back, and to all of you joining us for the first time, welcome. It's great to have you with us. So this afternoon, we will have a keynote speech from Fernando REIMERS, followed by 2 panel sessions. I would just like to say, before we start, to access interpretation, if you don't know already, you can get a headset from the table by the door. You're looking for French on channel 5, English on channel 6, and Spanish on channel 7. And if you're joining us online, please look for the globe icon in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen and select your preferred language. I will now welcome as moderator for the keynote speech, Muriel Poisson, team lead of the Knowledge Management and Mobilization team here at IIEP.
Good afternoon, colleagues. I have the pleasure to introduce Fernando REIMERS, but in fact, many of you knows already Fernando. Fernando, as you may know, is from the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and he's also, among many other different roles, a member of the US National Academy of Education and also the International Academy of Education. And so when we started preparing this event, our new director was very clear that he wanted us to focus on the future. And so we had started a web page with a bit of the past at the beginning of the page and more of the future at the bottom. He said we should reverse and really put the future at the very top. And among other things, Fernando, as you may know, also he has served on UNESCO's Commission on the Futures of Education, which has also a very important report called Reimagining Our Futures Together. And at the same time, he knows very well IIEP, and he published a book in 1990 on educational planning and management in Latin America. And he was also, I think, connected with the fundamental series of IIEP, so he knows very, very well IIEP. So this combination of knowledge of IIEP and also this perspective on future made him the right person to make this keynote speech on the future of planning as an introduction to the next session and thematic panels that we will start afterwards. So over to you, Fernando.
Thank you very much, Meryl, for the kind introduction, and thank you, Martin, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. I am going to talk about the future, but I'll talk a little bit about the past, which is, after all, the only thing we know. So what a pleasure it is to join you today to celebrate 60 years of the IIEP. The investment in building talent for educational planning and administration made by this institute has supported the remarkable transformation in educational opportunity, which educational systems have experienced during the last half a century. A transformation which gave most children and youth on the planet the opportunity to access school and to spend in school several years of their lives and to learn some things, maybe not everything we would like them to learn, but learn some things. The pioneers who helped shape and lead this institution, Philip Coombs, its first director, Clarence Beebe, a strong supporter and first director of the Fundamental series, Neville Postlewhite, Jacques Halak, Hans Weiler, François Caillot, Mark Bray, and many others, founders, created an epistemic community that established the field of educational planning around the world. Sorry, let me see, there we go. If the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is one of the greatest achievements of the human mind, the considerable transformation in global educational opportunity unleashed by the inclusion in the Declaration of the Right to Education was possible to a large extent by the success of UNESCO through institutions such as this one in building a network of experts around the world with shared beliefs, values, knowledge, and methods about how to support the expansion of educational improvement in education systems. What activity could be more complex than planning? An activity designed to invent the future, to bring about a world that doesn't exist, and to organize tasks and people around imagined and desired futures. Educational planning, which focuses on the opportunities to develop human talent for future generations, imagine, is even more complex, for it involves creating opportunities for learners that will help them gain the knowledge, the skills, the dispositions to allow the invention of that imagined future. The IIEP, in effect, shaped that network around shared understandings of how to carry out such complex activity for the purpose of influencing policy decisions made by governments around the world. Now, educational planning, as was discussed this morning, is a multifaceted process about setting goals, making decisions, taking actions to enhance the quality of education, includes a variety of planning efforts, each serving specific purposes, such as strategic planning, curriculum planning, instructional planning, financial planning, facility planning, enrollment planning, professional development planning, assessment and evaluation planning, technology integration planning, and so on. Educational planning also involves work at a macro, national, at a meso, institutional, and at a micro level, the school and the classroom, from system-wide planning for an entire national or state education system to planning for a subsystem, for example, teacher preparation and support, or curriculum planning to planning at the school and classroom level. But even more remarkable than the capacity to organize human effort in service of a world that doesn't exist, precisely to bring this world about, is the fact that such task was done not in a static and predictable world. Some of you may be too young to know this, but the 1960s were a time of great flux. And it is precisely because planning takes place in a world in flux that an institution such as IIEP has periodically re-examined the question of how such complex activity should be carried out as times change. So 60 years ago, when this institution was founded, the world was rather different than it is today, but not less interesting. It was, however, as is our world today, also a world experiencing tensions and mutations. It is worth noting then that this institution, designed to help invent the future, was not the product of a period of great stability, but rather of a period of deep social, political, economic, and technological transformations and dislocations. Technological changes in telecommunications, the push-button telephone was invented at that time, and broadcasting were opening up new opportunities for transmission of information. Exponential population growth raised concerns about the impact of such growth on resources and on the environment. In several countries in the global north, 4 major social movements were shaping the politics of those years: the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the anti-war movement, and the environmental movement. In the global south, the independence of many countries in Africa and Asia from colonial powers produced tectonic geopolitical shifts. In the US, the civil rights movement was challenging the pervasive racial inequality and discrimination which had characterized the country's history. The assassination of John Kennedy had a deep impact in the population, a visible sign of the fragility of the political order and of political leaders. The escalation of the Vietnam War, which would intensify in subsequent years, would eventually give rise to the anti-war movement and would cause eventually large segments of the American population to lose trust in government. Cultural transformations in music, in art, were challenging deeply established norms. Remember the Beatles? The women's liberation movement was challenging the norms of patriarchy and opening up opportunities for political and economic participation for half of the population which had been previously denied such opportunities. The Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union dominated international relations, including the dynamics of UNESCO. The Cuban Missile Crisis of '62 had made painfully evident the risk of nuclear war and the fragility of peace. Nuclear testing and nuclear proliferation began to raise concerns about the risks of war and about the environmental impact of nuclear testing. Against these trends, the educational priorities of the '60s focused on expanding access to education in the global south and more broadly on expanding educational opportunity. Clarence Beebe, one of the main supporters of the IIEP, had advanced reforms in New Zealand in the 1940s, before World War II and '50s, that sought to extend educational opportunity across socioeconomic divides before any country in Europe was actually thinking about the topic, a theme which would become a priority for this institute, for UNESCO, and for governments around the world more broadly in the '60s. Given that the main focus was on expanding access, there was relatively limited attention to the qualitative dimensions of education, a topic which some of the founders of the institute tried to call attention to, but only with modest success. Teaching was rather teacher-centered, often based on a transmission of knowledge approach, There was very limited use of technology, and experiential learning was uncommon. Beebe, on his book, The Quality of Education in the Developing World, which was published in 1966, and which he wrote when he spent 2 years at Harvard, put forth the insightful observation that not all teachers, an observation that we would do well to remember today, that not all teachers had the same level of quality, and that an education system could be usefully characterized attending to the proportion of teachers in various stages of professionalization. So Beebe cautioned against the notion of transferring ideas and practices from some systems to others without paying attention to the differences in the levels of professionalization of teachers in both systems. And that temptation continues today. I noticed this morning in one of the speakers that said, we would very much hope that the IIEP will continue to transmit the French education model to other countries, exactly the idea that Beebe cautioned against. Beebe was challenging the black box approach to educational planning that was dominant at the time, which focused on developing models to achieve quantitative targets of educational expansion without regard for the quality of education. It should be remembered that much of the expansion in access of education, which took place in the 60s and 70s, was done in 10 years of existence, creating multiple shifts in the same schools, getting the same groups of teachers to teach 2 or 3 shifts. And of course, that caused the reduction of the school day. And over time, some governments realized this was a big problem because it had actually reduced educational opportunity, and they're trying to course correct and create full day schools and so on. So a few years after Beebe's publication in '68, Philip Coombs, the first director of this institute, published his seminal book, The World Crisis in Education, another call against the mindless growth of access without attention to the financial implications to sustain such growth, given continued population growth. Now, curriculum planning in the 60s focused mostly on core subjects and primarily on knowledge. It was only after UNESCO's first commission on the futures of education produced the 4 report, Learning to Be, published in '72, that educational planners turned attention to which competencies should be gained in schools and to the role of the quality of the curriculum in supporting an education relevant to the needs of the present and to the needs of the future. UNESCO's recommendation of '74 concerning international understanding, cooperation, and peace, and education relating to human rights and fundamental freedoms, turned the attentions of planners to curriculum and teacher preparation. But interesting learning was slow to enter the world of educational planning, even though the first efforts to study which factors contributed to learning were contemporaneous with the development of the field of planning. It was in 1958 at UNESCO's Institute of Education in Hamburg that a group of researchers began to plan a comparative study of education, including Torsten Hussein, Neville Postlewhite, who had a long association with this institute. And it was in 1961 that the International Association for the Evaluation of Educational Achievement was launched at a meeting in Hamburg in the UNESCO Institute, animated in part by concerns over Sputnik and the race on science education it generated among the 2 competing blocs. The first results of the IEA, available only at the end of the 60s, along with the Coleman study in the US, began to shift attention in educational opportunity towards opportunity to learn. But the shift was slow, and it would be several decades until assessment of learning outcomes became part of the process of educational administration, and that this knowledge factored into educational planning and decision-making. And I would say that process is still contentious. Delighted to see here Silvia Schmelkes, who was the director of Mexico's Institute of Educational Planning, a huge educational institutional innovation that took place only in the year 2000 and which was recently dismantled. So this is not to say that everybody is on the bandwagon that we should actually pay attention to learning. So I've talked about the past. Let me turn to the future. I've offered this brief overview of some of the key societal and educational trends of the 60s, simply to illustrate that educational planning and the IIEP were born not in a static world, but in a world with much uncertainty about the future. Despite of it, or because of it, maybe, the founders of educational planning sought to structure human efforts and to provide predictability to such efforts through the invented tools and methods of educational planning. And it's good to remember that this is all invented. The Declaration of Human Rights is an invention. That education is something everybody should have is an invention. That we should plan things, this is all invented. we should celebrate that we've been so successful in getting people to accept these things as normal. That the validity of those methods and the soundness of the assumptions on which they were based would at times be challenged by the reality that unfolded is less relevant than the fact that those methods, the epistemic community of educational planners created by the IIEP, served to animate efforts of considerable proportion in expanding educational opportunity. For example, a common educational planning method of the 60s, an entire city in the country in which I was born, Venezuela, was planned using this method called manpower planning, which consisted of estimating the proportion of people working in different trades and occupations in a particular economy, and then using those coefficients, using those targets as a model to then get the place that the planning was done for to look like what. So in the case of that city, they looked at the economy of France, and then they said, well, what would it take for us to build an industry so that we could be like France in 20 years? Entire education systems were planned using those methods. And manpower planning, of course, didn't account for the fact that over time, the technologies in various industries would change, and with it, the requirement of skills and knowledge, and even the number of people employed in those industries. And as a result, education systems could find themselves on a trajectory to a no longer existing occupational structure in the labor market. Well, manpower planning is no longer used in the ways it was in the 60s. The idea of aligning the outputs of the education system to the needs of the labor market maintains its appeal, even as we know that the labor market continues to change as technologies evolve. So this example of the limitations of manpower planning illustrates how even as educational planning has taken place in context in flux, one challenge of planning has been how to keep up to accelerating societal and technological change. These three reports, commissioned by UNESCO, by commissions of independent individuals at three different times about the future of education, focus attention, I think, of this house, of UNESCO, and of the broader community on the question of what should people be learning? What is it that, what are the competencies that education systems should be teaching? The first is a report published in 1972, a product very much of the upheaval of the 60s I have just described. Edgar Faure, who chaired that commission, had been Minister of Education in France. And that report, as you remember, the big insight was the world is changing much faster than education systems, and therefore, the most important thing we should teach is the capacity to learn throughout life. The second report, produced by former chairman of the European Commission, Jacques Delors, who was the chair, and that report began to be prepared in 92, published in 96, basically dealt with globalization and said globalization is changing the way in which people interact with one another and participate, and globalization and technology, and therefore education systems should focus on a breadth of skills. And the big innovation of those four skills was learning to live together, really premonitory of the challenges we face. That report said globalization is going to cause people from different cultures and backgrounds to come into frequent contact with one another. And if we don't educate ourselves to see that as a source of strength, this is going to bring about a lot of conflict. The report of the third commission, tasked by UNESCO in 2019, the Saleh Work Zewde, named after the president of Ethiopia, who was the chair, published in November of 2021, emphasized the need to address not just a world in rapid flux, but existential challenges for humanity, such as climate change, democratic backsliding, poverty and inequality, challenges to human rights, and the challenges to be created by artificial intelligence. Now, illustrative of this rapid flux of the times that we now live, is the fact that since the most recent International Commission of the Future of Education was announced in the meeting of the General Assembly of the UN 2019, to the first time that we met in Paris in January of 2020, an epidemic was underway, which would soon disrupt the world of education globally and the world of the Commission in ways we could not have foreseen. The pandemic of COVID-19 defined not just the most visible educational challenges during the period when the Commission did its work, but also the way we had to do it, relying on digital communication technologies given the impossibility of travel and of in-person meetings. I was just chatting with Pauline Rose that neither she nor I have traveled very much since COVID, because we all discover that we could do many of those things relying on technologies which have a much lower carbon footprint on the environment than getting on a plane. There is no doubt that some of the salient themes in the report were shaped by what we learned from the disruptions of COVID. The emphasis on inequality and the challenges democracies were experiencing, reflecting challenges made more visible and augmented by the pandemic. The emphasis of that report on the power of teachers and communities and on the limitations in the power of governments reflected conditions that were very visible during the pandemic, of the fragility of public education systems, of the limitations of governments, and of the power of a whole of society approach and the need for collective leadership to sustain educational opportunity during those challenging times. But the velocity of change in our times and the unpredictability of the future would also be underscored again after the publication of our report on November of 2021. So one theme we didn't devote much attention to was the fragility of peace. And of course, the report didn't focus on the violence of war as one of the key challenges of humanity. And 3 months after our report was published, Russia had invaded Ukraine, reminding us of the shortcomings of our foresight. So given these limitations in our ability of predicting changes in a highly volatile world, is educational planning still useful? So I'd like to suggest that in the face of high volatility and unpredictability, educational planning is more rather than less necessary and useful. It is necessary because volatility and unpredictability create adaptive challenges, challenges without a simple technical answer, and for which prior knowledge is of limited use. Of course, educational planning needs to adapt to the velocity and nature of the challenges of our times, becoming more agile. I know that IIEP once worked with a GP producing an encyclopedia, which should be called Everything You Ever Wanted to Know About Educational Planning, a 3-tome thing that takes a lot of dedication to just read. And that has its purpose in helping the GP have the plans that it wants. But I'm going to suggest today that the GP shouldn't be the only audience for planners, that if planning is going to be relevant to the future, it should be thinking about the whole education system as the audience, and following those 3-tome series is probably not the best way to be accessible to most members of society. Planning needs to become more agile, articulating more explicitly the theories of action which underlie the plans to support the rapid learning and adaptation that the new challenges require. And this calls for increased use of the more agile education policy analysis rather than the comprehensive synoptic planning that produces 10 years plan, as if anybody knew where we're going to be in 10 years. And for an increased use of participatory methodologies, as was mentioned in the morning, which allow for the integration of interest and knowledge available in distributed institutional networks and of various levels of government, because some of the thorniest challenges of our time require collective action, coordination among various organizations and levels of governments. I think this is one of the great changes that has taken place since this house was invented, the emergence of civil society. I see Rukmini Banerjee here, the president, the CEO of Pratham, which has generated more innovation to serve the needs of the marginalized in India than the Ministry of Education of India could generate on their own. And the Ministry of Education of India is very wise to listen to Pratham and to work in partnership with them. And just like Pratham, there are many such organizations around the world. So the government is not the only show in town anymore, and perhaps not even the most important in some places. So educational planning to support rapid learning about adaptive challenges. There are educational challenges for which technical answers are not available, and they require innovation and experimentation, such as the challenge of how to teach young kids to read in school, and rapid learning and exchange of information that can feed back into the process of decision-making to revise those decisions. The education responses to the COVID pandemic are a good example of such challenges. For most systems, the challenge of teaching during the pandemic was novel, one for which no prior technical solutions existed. Many education systems face this challenge with rapid prototyping, innovating and learning rapidly from the results of those prototypes and exchanging information across systems. Now, this process required clear goals and priorities, the stuff of planning, and at least provisional ideas of how to achieve those goals. Those ideas were in fact just hypotheses about what could be done, which were confirmed or disconfirmed by the rapid prototypes. So planning served as the organizing framework of that process of innovation that engaged so many different actors, not just employees of the Ministry of Education. Without such plans, the response to the pandemic would have been, as was the case in some settings, just improvisation, activism without direction, and without possibility to evaluate and to determine what to change and what to continue. The systems that were able to sustain opportunity during the pandemic did so because they were able to unleash the creativity and innovation potential of many actors in the system: teachers, communities, parents, local education authorities, partner organizations. And the plans that supported such efforts, which were of course not 10-year plans, but agile plans, rapid plans along the lines of policy analysis that I have suggested, provided a framework that allowed those systems to learn from those efforts. In this way, transforming what would have been mere collaboration of many organizations into actual collective intelligence. The recognition of the innovation potential of local actors, recognizing that good ideas could come from anywhere, so valuable during the crisis represented by the pandemic, can be equally valuable to address other adaptive challenges. For instance, how to educate students to adapt to or mitigate climate change, or how to equip students with the knowledge and the skills to sustain democracy, even as democratic institutions are being challenged, or how to educate students for purpose and participation in a world transformed by artificial intelligence. New digital and telecommunication technologies enable forms of organization and communication across large groups that make possible deeper and more effective forms of participatory planning than were previously possible. For example, distributed groups of teachers can now collaborate developing a curriculum and relevant instructional materials to support such curriculum, as many did during the pandemic. In Vietnam, the country engaged about 100 schools and distributed the task of producing materials to teach an online curriculum. And they did that in a couple of weeks. In Colombia, the organization Teach for Colombia enlisted about 200 master teachers in its network to produce materials to teach the curriculum online. And because Teach for Colombia is part of a network of over 60 organizations around the world, that idea spread to other members of that network in different countries. In Chile, I think we have one of the co-founders of Teach for Chile here. The very day that the government announced that they were shutting down the schools, 2 teachers in that network said, how are we going to teach our kids? And because they had received a newsletter that told them that Teach for Nigeria had begun to create simple podcasts recorded on an iPhone with lessons, they said, let's do the same thing. And their podcast became so popular that the mayor in that municipality shared that idea in a meeting with 100 mayors. And pretty soon, this became national policy, and that idea extended to Peru. So this is an example of what I'm describing, that good ideas can come from anywhere, especially from organizations of civil society that know how to use the tools of communication to scale up practices and to learn from one another in ways that, frankly, governments are a little bit too slow to do, unable to do because of their scale and because of their constraints. So the potential of such collaborations can only be augmented by artificial intelligence, creating systems which provide teachers and students with highly personalized instructional resources. There are people already doing this to develop personalized curriculum through a collaboration of work created by teachers and AI-powered technologies. These forms of collaboration across networks of teachers, schools, and educational institutions represent a form of new power that can help us address challenges that have not been successfully addressed in the past. For example, the challenge of developing high-quality curriculum, the challenge that concerned Bibi in the 60s, which requires time and expertise that many teachers don't have, but which becomes feasible through collaboration among many teachers, which, by the way, I think is a far better option, to use these tools to produce something that can be contextualized and personalized than to develop these highly scripted curricula decided by people in Seattle who decide to push that curriculum foisted down the throats of people in places they have never visited and will never visit. And so educational planning to support collective leadership. Take, for example, the challenge of improving teacher quality in an education system, a process which involves alignment across several processes that form the teacher continuum, involving the process of attracting people to the profession, selection into initial teacher preparation, assignment to a school and grade, the process of induction into the first years of practice, ongoing professional development, support from principals and on the job, evaluation and career advancer, the whole shebang, right? Each of these processes typically involves one or several organizations under diverse authority, different levels of government, public and private. And to have coherence and alignment across the work of these various organizations It is essential that these organizations share goals and language, methods that permit coordination. But let's face it, they don't need a 10-year plan because none of them work for the government. And so the idea of a synoptic plan, kind of the old Soviet-style planning, as if a government could tell the organizations what they do, just doesn't match the reality of how the system works. Education planning can support such coordination and alignment, but not the kind of planning that an institution can do of the activities that it controls, but instead the kind of planning that supports the creation of collaboration of organizations within an ecosystem. I'm going to skip some of these ahead because I'm looking at the watch. There's still a few things I want to say. I'm going to skip these. Yeah. So planning is not disappearing, but it's going to be everywhere. And as more institutions become involved in planning, in a world in rapid flux, planning will become more necessary because more institutions are involved in the delivery of education. Now, the large role of macro-level planning, I think, is being replaced by a more distributed portfolio of educational plans crafted at the meso and micro levels, resulting from the growing role of decentralized levels of government, including the school or the university, as well as the role of the private sector and civil society in the delivery of services. This increasing redistribution of the authority for the delivery of education will require more, but also different type of planning, both because each institution needs to plan, but also because planning becomes a lingua franca that allows communication across those institutions. Technology and AI are enablers of the integration of these decentralized efforts into a coherent strategy. For instance, increasingly, schools have more autonomy over certain education decisions, and they need to plan. I see Mark here, who's devoted a good part of his career to the study of decentralization. And now, schools, of course, need to plan for the decisions over which they have authority. And there are ways in which those plans of the schools can be aggregated upwards into systems that capture variability in these plans and in the results. And as the result of that, can learn from that experience and further support that variability of local level planning. Now, it should be noted that the integration of such participatory and collaborative forms of planning involves not the translation of designs from the top into specific plans at various sublevels, but rather the articulation of these various levels of planning, again, recognizing that good ideas, both about what topics should be a priority and how to address them, can come from anywhere, not just from the levels with formal authority in the public system. I spent a bit of time this summer in Sokoto, northern Nigeria, the land of Boko Haram, and it's so clear to me and to local actors that their big priority is how to keep these kids from being recruited by these groups. But in that context, to tell the education system that the only thing they should focus their attention on is foundational literacy is something that increasingly these local actors say, how good is it going to be for these kids to know how to read if they have no hopes for the future, if the only hope that they have is to join one of these gangs of bandits? So as planning moves closer to the student and the teacher, it's possible to rely on user-centered design to identify education needs and to generate solutions to those needs. Design thinking becomes a tool to enhance educational planning from the bottom of the education systems upwards. These decentralized participatory processes can also give greater voice to teachers and to students, and in this way enhance the relevancy of education plans, their connections to education problems that students and teachers actually think they have. And the efficacy of the solutions as those closer to the problems and with knowledge of the specific context where those problems have to be addressed, have greater voice in shaping what needs to be addressed and how. Methods such as the logical framework approach, which have been around for many decades, had already anticipated how to leverage the power of participatory processes to identify problems, their root causes, and ways to address them. And new technologies just make it a lot easier to involve many more people in those processes. So the future. The future of planning will be shaped by a combination of ongoing trends and emerging factors reflecting the evolving needs and aspirations of learners, advances in technology, societal changes. In addition to the trends I've already mentioned, the following themes related to learning outcomes will likely shape the future of education. Much greater emphasis on competency-based education, as education shifts from a time-based model to one based on demonstrating competency, and where learners can progress at their own pace and earn credentials or certificates where they can show mastery of specific skills and knowledge. The focus is going to be increasingly, as anticipated by UNESCO's 3 reports, on breadth of skills, including cognitive and social-emotional competencies, and on reliance on instructional tasks which provide authentic, relevant, and meaningful opportunities to learn as the building block of the curriculum. Globalization and intercultural competency, educational planning will, by necessity, be promoting global awareness and intercultural competency, and ethical and social-emotional learning, I think, will be an important driver of planning. It was so interesting. The first publication of the fundamentals, a booklet by Philip Coombs called Qu'est-ce que c'est la planification de l'éducation, goes to great length into saying planning is value neutral. It can be adopted by dictators and elected leaders alike. It has nothing to do with your particular philosophy in the world. And I think that many places are going to realize that they need to make the question of goals front and center, because education systems are based on an ethical core. There are going to be other drivers of what planning will be: personalization and differentiation, blending and online learning, lifelong learning, inclusive education, AI and personalized support, project-based and experiential learning, redesigning assessment systems, and the focus on teacher PD. Now, I think, and I'll conclude here, that, here it is, that we're going to have much greater attention in the future to the goals of education than we did 60 years ago. Educational planning rests on an ethical foundation because education is a purpose-driven and ethical enterprise. It's not solely driven by the professional goals of teachers, but also by the goals of schools, universities, and education systems. And from time to time, it's necessary to reevaluate those goals to ensure that education remains relevant in addressing the challenges of the present and the foreseeable future. And it is necessary to reevaluate the goals of education that make planning necessary. The world is currently experiencing an acceleration of challenges related to human rights, to democratic backsliding, and to climate change. And this is a crucial moment for that reevaluation. This is the big theme of the last report of UNESCO's Commission on the Futures of Education, reimagining, what is it called? Reimagining the Futures of Education, something like that. And so let me just close and basically insist that, of course, it's not going to be, these are some of the challenges that I think should be at the core of educational planning. But if we're going to make these challenges something that engages the creativity of the whole of society, we won't be able to do that with 1,000-page documents produced following that encyclopedia that you produce. We're going to need documents that reach everybody, and we are going to need different strategies of communication, which exist, by the way. Talk to any high school student, and they're very aware of, talk to Greta Thunberg, and she's very aware of what tools of communication can be used to mobilize all the people her age to demand the adults that they pay more attention to climate change. And I think that is one of the possibilities for planning, both to engage the energy, the creativity, the desires, the passions, and the knowledge of people everywhere, and then back to organize their work. But let me say that I don't expect any of these to be easy. In fact, one of the ways in which the third report on the futures of education is very different from the 2 previous reports, for the reasons I already mentioned, is the 2 previous reports are very clearly addressed to ministers of education, with the expectation that they would be launched at the General Conference that is taking place here, and that if those ministers basically sign on, good things would happen. And our report didn't share that assumption. And for that reason, the report said, no, this is addressed to the whole of humanity. This is an invitation to students, to teachers, to parents, to communities, to our local governments, as well as to governments, to begin this conversation, this dialogue on what are the goals that we should be paying attention to, and how do we align what education system is doing with respect to those goals, and how do we do it? I don't have the impression that we have been very successful. I mean, even though we wrote that, I would have expected that 2 years into that report was published, in fact, there would be a global conversation going on about the futures of education, and I don't think it is ongoing. So perhaps we were wrong. Perhaps this new power, which Greta Thunberg knows how to master, is not a power that educational planners or university professors for that matter should dabble into. But I do think that aligning education goals with existing existential challenges requires that we reimagine the full range of activities in schools, promoting a culture of literacy that goes beyond basic skills, engaging students with real-world problems, teaching them to recognize the importance of diverse viewpoints, something that is increasingly challenging to do, even in universities, and fostering critical thinking and collaboration, because failure to undertake this task could leave students very poorly prepared for a world that is changing very rapidly and that is very vulnerable. So in conclude, let me just thank those of you who sustain this institution today, which is celebrating its 60th anniversary, because I believe your work building capacity to carry out educational planning is essential to building the futures of education. Now, looking back, it's evident how much of the educational expansion of the last 6 decades owes to that epistemic community, the networks of change makers that were educated by this institute. And looking forward, I'm hopeful that your continued work will expand those networks even further with new and more agile approaches that can help educational institutions continue to invent a better future. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Fernando, for this presentation. I'm sure some.
I don't have to skip half of the page.
No, that was good, but it's good to keep a bit of time also for the discussion. Some of the people, I'm sure, will ask us whether the paper of this symposium, including yours, will be made available. And so we should tell also all of the colleagues here that all the speakers have made the big efforts of preparing papers for this symposium and events, and all of them, of course, will be made available. I think since this morning we have had a kind of a silent crowd here without a lot of opportunities to speak. But I'm sure that there are some former IP colleagues. There are also many new IP colleagues that would like also, I'm sure, to raise a number of questions within the room. We have also some kind of online audience that have been listening to you. There are members of the Future of Education Commission that are also among ourselves, and you have also challenged a little bit our colleagues also on this GPE IP guidelines, and I'm sure that there are some IP staff that would like to react to this one. So we're going to pass a mic. Before maybe you are preparing your question, I had just one question to you, Fernando, because you have been writing a lot in recent years in democratic setbacks and backlash in different countries. You have documented this, especially in terms of their impact on democratic education. You have evoked it very shortly here. But it would be interesting to hear also from you how much it can affect planning, according to you. And that echoes also what we have been hearing this morning from some of the countries in Burkina Faso and others, where this evolution of the political environment also may have an impact on planning.
It's a very important question. And let me answer in 2 ways. The first, that's one of the themes that I tried to present, which is that these institutions that were created 60, 80 years ago, when the world was very different, when the main show in town were governments, need to recognize that societies are a lot more diverse, a lot more plural, and that people expect to have participation. So we're no longer living in a world where it'll be accepted to most of humanity to have a small group of people in a room of Paris or Washington decide how is it that children should be learning, or whether that they should be learning should be the priority. And so that is a question certainly for this institute. Who is the audience of planning? And I think that there are still some planning offices around the world that, especially in the developing world, that operate under the assumption that the primary audience of planning are the donor agencies. And I recognize that in a country that actually needs access to those resources, that is, for good or for bad, an audience. But if that is the only audience, we're going to continue to have the challenges that Director Benavides referred to this morning when he said a lot of planning has failed to actually connect with the dynamics of change at the school level. Yeah, but why should it have connected if the school is an afterthought of this whole process of planning? So I think planning that doesn't understand that the audience is the entire education system, is the local community, is designed to discover at the implementation stage that those whose views you ignored will make their views heard by ignoring your plans or by not being ready to participate in those plans. So that's one level. I do think times have changed, and I worry that these wonderful institutions that were created a long time ago may not have fully appreciated what that means in terms of the work they do. Let me give you an example. 60 years ago, when this institute was created, there were less than 5,000 universities around the world. Today, there are about 30,000. This is a phenomenal transformation in institutional capacity. And I would ask, how many of the existing UN agencies actually work with those universities, not symbolically, actually work with them as partners in getting them to focus on the problems in a place like Sokoto, understanding the problems and finding the solutions to those problems. The second level at which I would like to answer your question is, of course, some of these challenges of democracy, and I've written a recent paper, which I'll be happy, it's published in the Education Policy Analysis Archives, on the new challenges of democracy, not the old challenges, but the new challenges, disinformation, extreme polarization, also influence the rise of populism, also affect planning, because some of these challenges are about not believing in expert knowledge fundamentally, and in institutions that are about expert knowledge. So just like this is the first time in my lifetime that people in the United States are asking, what good do universities do for societies anyway? And why should we treat them so well? I'm sure that there are many people asking, also in the United States and elsewhere, what good does the UN do for humanity anyway? And why should we treat them so well? And so that is a challenge of the world in which we live, because there is a whole ideology that is, on the one hand, rejecting globalism and the cosmopolitan values, I would say, of the Enlightenment. I don't think that cosmopolitan values were an invention of the post-World War II order, but these cosmopolitan values that humanity shares some basic things in common just because we're all humans, that we are all earthlings, before and beyond any of the invented divides that we have created, that powerful idea which animates the declaration. If you read the declaration, someone referenced, someone on your board, the declaration this morning, the genius of the Declaration of Human Rights is that it says, it's Ubuntu. I cannot fully achieve my humanity if I don't engage with you in helping you achieve your own humanity. It's a genius idea, but that idea is being challenged at the time in which we live. That idea is being challenged, sadly, by ideologies that are not new. White supremacy, by the idea that some groups of humans have superior rights to other humans. In some parts of the world, that idea is being replaced. The idea of Ubuntu is being replaced with the idea that I cannot survive if you survive, and that my survival requires that I eliminate you. Of course, you realize what kind of world that produces. And so that changes and limits the authority of governments, the ability of democratic governments, and the ability of institutions based in knowledge. But I don't know what to say in response to that challenge. I mean, the response of what to do with those who challenge education is more education. The response of those who question why knowledge, why expert knowledge is not less expert knowledge, is more expert knowledge in a way that is accessible to people. That's why I think it would be, just like I believe that universities would be much better understood by the rest of society if they visibly took an interest in the problems of society, and if they found a way to communicate the great work they do in ways that would be accessible to most of society. But for example, one of the areas that I work with is climate change. And I began to work on climate change and education after spending several years with a group at Harvard on climate change, composed mostly of physicists and chemists and so on. And I realized that this group mostly talks to themselves. They write in journals that they read that most of the public cannot access. And I thought, well, no wonder we have these problems. If this group doesn't connect to teachers, and we just organize a meeting with teachers and with some of these scientists. And it actually is not rocket science to bring these two communities together. And they both have things to bring to the enterprise of how do we educate, but we're not doing enough of that. So I do think that some of these challenges for democracy are new. They are part of the new terrain. I wish more people appreciated how serious they are, because I think that they're like climate change, maybe they're happening on a time scale that is different than the time scale in which we live. And that's why we see our freedoms eroded. Just a footnote. I published 2 books. I try to publish things in open access because I do believe that knowledge is to be accessible to people, not just to those who can buy books. And so I published just about the same week 2 things. And I'm going to give you an order of magnitude of the interest. One was a book on the impact of climate change, of the impact of COVID on education systems 3 years in. And within a week or 2, 15,000 people have downloaded the book. At the same time, we published a special issue of a journal produced by members of the International Academy of Education on how the new challenges of democracy are affecting education. And only 500 people have downloaded that. And I'm wondering, clearly, democracy and its future is not a sexy topic, but it would have huge consequences, I'm sure, if we lose it for all of us.
And then in question also the role of the academic community and of the researchers. And since there are quite a number of researchers in the room, a number of academic people and others, maybe some of you wants to take the floor and to raise a number of questions. So maybe we can pick up a few of them. Mohamed, if you want to, yes, please.
Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Good afternoon. My name is Mohamed Miani. I am a student and researcher in the Jules Verne Picardie University in France. Thank you very much for this overview of 60 years of education planning, as well as this overview of the future of education. You talked about the role of the IIEP community in the IIEP. And my question has to do with the role of researchers in the development of education planning, bearing in mind that planning has to do with operations.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about the role of research. I don't think the role of planning is only an operational role. I think that planning certainly needs to be based on knowledge of the facts, on a comprehensive understanding of the state of the world as it exists. But planning also is a task of imagination. It's not just a task. Research cannot tell us directly what is it that you do with an education system. Research can tell you what relates to what causes what, and COVID is the best example of that. We could have used better research, but COVID created a novel setting that required invention. Now, that invention can be more disciplined with planning that names goals, strategies, and so on and so forth. That is correct. I haven't talked enough about research. And when I talk about the great possible partenariat between universities and planners, that is exactly what I have in mind. I do think it is very important to use the knowledge that exists. And by knowledge, I have a pluralist conception. I'm not referring only to, there is a subgroup among my colleagues who have decided to create an industry for themselves by saying there is only one kind of knowledge that counts, and is the kind of knowledge that I produce. In my experience working in a range of countries, there is a lot of available research about the education system that is largely underutilized by planners. And there were some good efforts back in the 1980s to build networks of researchers in various countries. So in Latin America, this network was a network that connected some of the main research centers in Latin America, REDUC. And what REDUC set out to do was simply to capture all research knowledge and to make it readily available for people to use. But I think that there's a big gap between the availability of that knowledge, even when it has been processed and is available, and the utilization of planners. And I think that's a missed opportunity. Having said that, and as someone who spends time doing research, I don't think there is a singular study that is going to answer the questions of a planner. So what we're talking about is informing the understanding of what the problems of an education system are, what possible solutions are, with the full range of knowledge from that system and elsewhere. And so yeah, I agree that there is an opportunity to do more of that, and it's a good thing that certainly this is understood by development organizations when they engage in systematic reviews of research. For example, I think that the Global Monitoring Report of UNESCO, which is to me another jewel produced by this institution, by this house, which is a lot more than reporting on where we are in the goals of in SDG 4, and which has a thematic focus every year, is a real effort to integrate. And I know they commission tons of studies, but they mostly reach out to people who already know what research exists, and they basically focus on a theme every year. That's a very good example of how research can shape the gestalt of planners as to, okay, what are the problems that we have? What are the priorities? What are some of the ideas that we can rely upon to solve them? Speaking of the global monitoring, I have great appreciation for how Manos Antoninis, who now leads the effort, has understood that it's very, very important to go beyond the single 500 or 1,000 page document that presents those findings, even if it's an open access document, and to create multiple products that would reach multiple audiences and constituencies with shorter, more succinct, kind of thematic publications and so on.
Fernando, we have also some questions from our online audience. One from Luis Gabriel, who is talking about the risk related to the inclusion of AI in education, maybe from a planning perspective, and maybe also more at the school level. So that's the first one. And the second one is about how you suggest organizing, listening to, and engaging more with communities and families. Again, maybe at different
So assuming that this question refers to the use of AI for curriculum and lesson planning purposes, the risk of AI is that we use AI in silly ways. Let me give you an example of what I mean. If you go to ChatGPT and you tell ChatGPT, as I have, give me a climate change curriculum for students in the 7th grade in the state of New Jersey, aligned with the next generation science standards, it'll give you a curriculum that on the format is actually quite adequate. It has goals, learning outcomes, suggested activities, bibliography. But if you analyze that curriculum through a Bloom's taxonomy, it's all at the 2 lowest levels in the Bloom taxonomy. It's all about transmission of knowledge. Now you can go back and say, well, how about if you give me something on higher levels of the Bloom taxonomy? How about if you emphasize evaluation? It'll give you something better. But I do find that a tool like that, first of all, I don't know how many teachers in the world are today capable of producing that curriculum. But my guess is probably not more than 30%. And that's probably a very hopeful estimate, that 30% of the teachers can develop a climate change curriculum that is on the format acceptable, or that is at the basic level, knowledge transmission of the Bloom's taxonomy. So given that reality, not such a bad thing to use a tool, even if we use it in silly ways. But of course, where I see AI functioning is as a tool to augment human capacity, to allow collaboration. And so I'll give you an example. One of the things I have done is to develop curriculum aligned with the SDGs, where we take, I call that global citizenship curriculum. So we take SDGs and we figure out what are the learning standards that should relate to the achievement of these 17 goals. And then you map backwards, what should a sequence that is both progressive and rigorous look like from kindergarten to high school to help a student actually master those learning standards. So a human who knows about the subject matter and about curriculum and about children can do that. But I have now worked with colleagues who are interested in my curriculum who say, how about if we put these on AI-powered platforms that will allow teachers to develop their own playlists, not just to take your curriculum as you imagine it, but to develop something that is more personalized for them. And to me, that's a huge improvement. So on the whole, I'm not saying AI is going to solve all of our education problems, but just like our lives are greatly enhanced because we can carry these little computers around and do a lot of work when we travel, or we carry more computing power in our pockets than was available to Philip Coombs when he directed this institute in the largest computer he could get access to. I think AI is going to be a great support, a great collaborator for humans. And I've already seen things in the field of curriculum development that are useful. And now you have to remember this, right? AI is so far based on language models. So it is not really intelligent in any true sense of the term, What it is, it's a tool where computer code can access text and then predict what text goes together, essentially. But if I'll give you a use that I have for AI. So I have read the reports of the International Panel on Climate Change. I can tell you it takes a lot of interest, more than reading the 3 volumes of planning that the IIEP developed for GPE, a lot of interest and dedication and time to read those reports and then understand about 80% of what they say, because it's all about probabilities. I mean, one of the things you need to understand climate change is understand to think in systems and probability. You can't do that if you don't practice those skills, can't understand those reports. So I've read those reports. Now, it would be wonderful if we could find a user-friendly way for any teacher who has to develop lessons to access the knowledge in those reports. I think AI will help us do that. It'll be possible to put all that text in an AI-powered platform and to develop the capacities of teachers to develop good curriculum. So I don't think AI is going to replace teachers. I suspect that the biggest risk we should worry about with AI, as with many improvements, is not that it'll replace teachers, is that it'll augment inequalities, because I anticipate that those who will most benefit from the use of AI are the most capable teachers. And sadly, what COVID made visible for us, is how unequal the levels of, it's the same problem that concerned Bibi in the 1960s, how different the levels of skills of teachers are in different schools in the same systems or across schools. So here is this innovation that is certainly going to increase this gap, unless the planners are smart to figure out a way to speak to many constituencies about what we need to do to lift the bottom half.
And in fact, this is going to make a smooth transition to our next panel that will be dealing with digital technology and different ways to use digital technology as part of the learning process, but also as part of the planning process. So there'll be Pablo, I think he's going to more or less move on the same line. Just wanted to conclude this session by getting back to some of the words that you've put on the screens related to planning, talking about supporting collective leadership in the education systems, promoting more agile planning approaches, articulating more explicitly series of action underlying plans, refocusing on learning and classroom experience, recognizing the innovative potential of local actors, renewing the concept of planning building on the principle of collective intelligence, and considering ubiquitous planning, because I think those can infuse all of the discussion that we will have as part of the 6 thematic panels that are now going to start with our colleagues that are going to speak on the digital technology and impact on planning.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Fernando. Thank you, Muriel. Now we will discuss, as Muriel has just told you, a very important and relevant topic on IIEP's first thematic priority. How can digital technology help transform planning and management tools and approaches? So we are delighted to welcome as moderator for this session, education specialist at UNESCO, Mark West. In his role, Mark examines how technology can improve the quality, equity, and accessibility of learning. So over to you, Mark.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being with us here for this interesting panel discussion. I think it's very appropriate that we're coming after the remarks that Professor REIMERS gave. And I think some of the questions that were focused on the implications of these remarkable new digital technologies that we're seeing. This is something that's on everybody's mind. Fernando and I work very closely on the Futures of Education report that was mentioned. And at that time, we understood that digital technologies were very important to the future of teaching and learning. But I think we can agree that even today, those implications look even more expansive than they did when we were working on this report in 2019 and 2020. Before introducing our panelists, I just wanted to share a little bit about some of UNESCO's broader work on ICT and education, on AI, and some of the different sort of priorities that UNESCO is exploring. In addition to all of the excellent work that IIEP is leading in planning, UNESCO is, of course, also looking very closely at the implications of these new technologies for education, for educational management, for educational planning, but also for applications inside of classrooms and very sort of practical on-the-ground uses of technology. The 2023 GEM report, which has been accessed a few times, obviously had a very specific focus on digital technologies and their implications for education. And for those of you who have not had a chance to read or see the report, strongly encourage you to take a look. They have worked very hard to explore the evidence base around digital technologies and education. And again, the messages are that it's messy, it's mixed, it's hard to show clear correlation between the integration of these technologies and improved learning outcomes. I'm sure this is something we'll discuss during the panel. The Futures of Education report that we mentioned, this was obviously a sort of key output for UNESCO, visioning, looking to the future. And as Professor REIMERS mentioned, an invitation to sort of discuss this at all levels. And then finally, I also wanted to mention a publication which is very close to our team. This is our EdTech Tragedy publication, and this work looks at the experiences of COVID-19 and really what happened when all of education became reliant on digital technologies, and would encourage people to take a look at this. It's a large volume, as you can see, but we really look at sort of the evidence around this unique period of time when all of education was reliant on remote and distance technologies. So we're now going to move into our panel presentations. The first segment of this session will have 10-minute presentations from two of our different panelists, and then we will have some more open sort of exchange and dialogue. We hope to keep this pretty active and lively, so if people have questions or a burning comment, please feel free to raise your hand and we'll try and bring those in. So today, just briefly to introduce who's with us, sitting over here at the end, this is Pablo Estrales. He's the head of IIEP, UNESCO Regional Office for Latin America and the Caribbean in Buenos Aires. So basically, Pablo's running IIEP's sister office in Latin America and in Argentina. So Pablo, thank you very much for being here. And then right here, this is Amélie Gagnon. She is the lead of UNESCO's IIEP Data and Evidence Cluster. So somebody who is very much working on questions of how to use data and new technologies to improve educational planning and educational management, the focus of our topic. And then this is Martin Ribar. Martin is the Professional Development Manager for Plan CIBAL in Uruguay. And for those of you who may not know, Martin will explain more about what CIBAL does. But basically, CIBAL is responsible for digital learning in schools in Uruguay. And then finally, we have Gregory Elacqua, and he is the Principal Economist at the Education Division for the Inter-American Development Bank. So anyway, we have a fantastic panel here and looking forward to the interventions from our different experts. So to begin, we'd like to invite Pablo to provide a short presentation that he's prepared and then have a chance for a few quick questions following his intervention. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I'm going to be speaking in Spanish, so please get your, what do you call them? Okay. Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to talk about broken promises. Now, for the past 2 decades, we can see that there have been major financial investments to digitalize education services, and this has been done with the idea We're just waiting for the headsets to be distributed.
Good way of grabbing attention. So let's continue.
As I was saying, ladies and gentlemen, in almost all countries for about 20 years, there have been considerable financial investments to digitalize education and promote education technology. And all this was based on the premises that digital technology is going to enhance the quality of education. But the results that were obtained after 20 years in many countries were extremely disappointing. Now, let's see what's the origin of this disappointment. Is it the digital technologies that did not keep up to their promises, or is it something else? Now, what lessons can we learn from this failure? Do you need to completely do away with these digital technologies, or do you need to basically stop relying on technology and be a bit more pessimistic in your approach? Now, let's try and think together and basically recapitulate. Now, digital technology did give rise to a lot of hope, and I'm going to sum this up with 3 promises that were made. First of all, we were supposed to widen inclusion in education because we really wanted to bring people on board via computers and internet. And then we were supposed to make learning easy through machine learning and other programs. And another promise that goes back in time is all this would have all this was supposed to digitalize education. We're going to digitalize processes and work at the ministries and basically enhance the entire service delivery. Now, why are we're saying that these promises were broken? We're going to analyze each of these failures, and we're going to basically look at the research done by IIEP in Latin America and the Caribbean islands, and we can extrapolate these to other parts of the world as well. Now, the promise that was made is that digital technology was going to lift obstacles, preventing minorities from accessing education. But there was unequal access to technology itself. And this was a stark problem in many regions of the world. There are so many regions in the world which are not well connected. And many regions where there is connection, the quality leaves much to be desired. So this has just exacerbated the inequalities. And this is a paradox because digital technology has only promoted inequalities. Now, with regard to the second promise, many people were convinced, and I was one of them, that digital technologies in classrooms is going to make learning easy. Some of them even thought that you could actually learn without teachers being present in classrooms. But clearly, the reality does not really match what we thought. The conclusions are not convincing in this field. And it's the same for the fact that certain researches that were carried out in Latin America a few years ago show that digital technologies were used at the same time with traditional education, or where knowledge was passed on in the classrooms. And we thought that it was because of this that there was the failure. Now, this experience in Latin America can apply to many places in the global south. The slow development of digitalization, depending on where you are. We can see that many schools are collecting data in a physical form, and this data is underexploited. IT systems, education systems do exist, and they're just in their infancy. So again, it is underused. Now, the fact that you are bringing about digitalization in education is not enough. It's not a wonder, miracle solution. There is a potential, of course. In light of the experiences we've had in IIEP, there are systems designed for enhancing learning in certain regions of the world. We are trying to improve education systems by promoting digitalization in schools. And then there are other establishments, other regions, other countries that are trying to do for planning and education. The first trend we see is the connectivity offer in schools. We must make sure that all regions have the same level of quality, and we really must promote the underprivileged. You also need to review the current learning and teaching models. Even remote working during the pandemic was difficult for some. So you really need to make sure that there is the necessary infrastructure that's conducive to remote learning. You can work in classrooms, but with information sources outside the classrooms. And we're just actually looking at the initial stages of this new technology. Now, we also have to redo teaching programs so that they are better catered to the challenges of the digital era. I'm thinking of the pedagogical plans. You really must make sure that the curriculum should be linked, and there should be some kind of connection, some kind of bridges between traditional learning and the modern learning with robotics. There's also a change in teacher training and the non-teaching staff, so that this category of population can also be brought up to the scratch. So there should be some kind of link between the pre-service training and in-service training, so that teachers feel comfortable with the technology. The fifth trend is that digitalization of school systems is extremely important, and you really need to make sure that the entire school management system is digitalized. You need digital files, pupil files that need to be digitalized. You really need to make sure that their certificates and all other particulars are digitalized. So and this is quite time consuming. And this brings us to the sixth trend that we've observed. It's the creation or strengthening of education management systems. So you need digital platforms that help us get instant access to information on training, on learning, on school transfers, on diplomas, on that way we would have early warning systems that would avoid any kind of dropout from schools. Now, all this means we need a complex and a deep system. So when we turn to the past, we can see that the use of digital technology is not a guarantee to success, is not synonymous with success. You really need to change the structure and bring about deep-rooting changes. In other words, digital technology in education should not be viewed as as an objective, but it's actually a means to achieve a certain objective, because the success hinges on how we use this technology. So we really need to have a critical view of the technology, and you can't be just blindly optimistic or pessimistic. Technology must become an efficient tool. We are still grappling in the darkness. We are trying to include a maximum number of people, and the 6 trends that are valid for Latin America and the Caribbean region will help us guide the work of other establishments in the world to better plan, to ensure inclusion, to basically digitalize education and planning. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop right here.
Pablo, thank you very much for the intervention and the presentation. A very quick follow-up question. I really appreciated the juxtaposition of these sort of soaring promises that are held for digital technologies and the often underwhelming or even disappointing reality of their access in education systems with teachers, with learners. You mentioned this promise of equity that I think is repeated again and again. This idea, this vision that these digital technologies will finally equalize access to educational opportunities, equalize access to learning, to knowledge. Yet the reality seems to be that these technologies are only widening divides which were already gaping, that they're getting wider still. And with fear of sort of putting you on the spot, I was wondering if you could maybe give us some concrete ideas of how we can ensure that these technologies are not simply inflaming inequity, but are actually beginning to bridge and narrow it. Over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what we were trying to say. I mean, something that we found out in our research was that, as so many other people have also found out, that there's a paradox in the increase of use of technology in education systems, which is that even though it does allow some people to access better education, at the very same time allows other people to be excluded. So I guess the problem with how to avoid that is that it involves economy. I mean, it involves investment, and when for example, a country, and I'm not mentioning any country in particular, but I certainly know cases like this, at least in my region, decide to, for example, make a big acquisition of computers, for example, and because that looks very good on the newspaper. Oftentimes, it doesn't come along with the necessary with providing access through internet. And so what happens is that it's just for the show. And so how would you prevent that? I guess by becoming more knowledgeable about this and raising awareness that is some sort of that's a lie. That is not as simple as getting a computer to a kid that you would produce this improvement of learning. I mean, that's something that we've learned. It took us almost 20 years to learn it, but I think that we have learned by now.
Excellent. And then, Pablo, one final question. I know that you organized a regional forum in October on how new technologies can transform education. I was wondering if you could share with us and the audience here maybe one or two sort of paramount findings, recommendations to come out of that forum that could enlighten us here.
Well, most of what we did in the forum was to present these promises and see how the countries in the region had responded to those promises. I would say that one big contribution of the regional forum this year was precisely coming up with these recommendations that come as a way of trends that we have noticed in the countries. Ultimately, I think that the big lesson that we have learned is that it's very easy to trick the public by letting them know that you are investing in technology as a magic bullet that will solve all the problems. I mean, we are tired of seeing cases over and over in Latin America, but I'm sure that this could be applied to other parts of the world, where a lot of investment has been made. Just to give you a very simple example, I actually was witness. I'm not going to mention where this happened. It was a place where a lot of investment had been made to buy computers for the classroom. It wasn't in Uruguay, and but the thing is that they invited me to one of the classrooms, supposedly one of the good classrooms, and what I saw was a second grade classroom in which a teacher was teaching how to add and subtract, and it was making the kids do this game in the computer where we have the numbers and then you fill up the gaps and the computer tells you if you're right or wrong. Okay. So, so far so good. But by the end of the lesson, the teacher said, okay, kids, now write down everything on your notebooks. And I was really intrigued by that. I honestly didn't understand. And I tried to be very, not assume anything. So by the end of the class, I approached the teacher and I asked this person, very delicately, would you explain why is it that you made the kids write down everything they had done in the computer into the notebooks? And she had no answer. I mean, she just the way she used to do things. But of course, that is the risk of doing, like in that place, a big investment without touching the teachers, because the ultimate assumption, sometimes this cannot be said out loud, is that the technology was going to bypass the teachers, and that doesn't happen.
Great, thank you very much, Pablo. We'll now move on to our second presentation. Martin will be sharing some insights from the CIBAL program in Uruguay. Thank you, Martin.
Yo también voy a hablar en español, así puedo contestar más apasionadamente, ya que Pablo, como decimos en Uruguay y que somos muy futboleros, me levantó muchos centros.
I will be happy to answer any question you may have with a passion akin to the one that I have for soccer. Thank you very much for inviting me to UNESCO. And I would like to hail this organization on this occasion. I'm very happy to be able to take the floor today to talk to you about my experience So I would like to urge you to keep an eye on the clock. I'm very good at looking at management and planning, but as a teacher, I'm sometimes unable to keep my speaking time in check. So Pablo gave me a lot of material on which I would like to rebound. So this, my organization is based in Uruguay. It's a small country. This is my next slide. It's a small country located in Latin America, south of the continent, and it's sandwiched between Brazil and Argentina. For about 15 years, we have had to dream of a different country. I would like to highlight a few ideas that were developed over the past 15 years. This center, my center, called CEBAL, has been developed and fully funded by our citizens, by our government. It's focused on developing technologies. To start with, there was a huge gap between those who had access to home-based digital resources. We're talking about relatively wealthy people on the one hand, and on the other hand, with young people who had no such technology at home. In the country, we therefore developed a public policy for educational purposes, and we created a digital agenda with a wide range of institutions whose purpose was to increase innovation, to work on innovation and on improving numeracy and digital skills. Why am I talking about all this? Well, it is all very much in line with inclusion and democratization of technologies. This is something that matters to us. Technology inclusion, equity, equality is something that is very dear to our heart. And what was clear right from the onset was that all governments shared a vision. CEBAL very quickly became part and parcel of the public of the tissue of public authorities. We talked about it over lunch. CEBAL is very widely accepted in the general population. Let me get back to my soccer metaphor. I'm very sorry about this, but unfortunately, we are great soccer fans, and I would like to say that we are very proud. Even independent thinking people in Uruguay are very happy to have such an institution. We have said a lot about planning. We have talked about including every stakeholder within society, and ranging from citizen organizations, public authorities. We benefit from a direct communication with CEBAL. We know that in order to come up with solutions to the challenges that were described by Pablo, we were very much aware that no one single solution could be found. There are large trends. Initially, people thought that technologies were going to be a universal answer to all our problems, and we knew it. We have then realized that that would not be the case. We know that solutions lie with the very practice of education. So we are very much halfway there. We have focused on technologies that can help, that can improve the situation, but we did not forget about stakeholders. We're talking about, and I'm talking about teachers, all stakeholders, parents, communities, mothers, fathers. We work very closely with families. All of this led to a better ownership of CEBAL within society. So how did this happen over the past 15 years? Number one, what I would like to say is that this policy is very dynamic. If we hadn't evolved from our starting point in 2007, I would not be able to give you all the positive results. that we experienced. We used the one-to-one model as a starting point. We started by providing computers. We focused on hardware. We connected all teaching centers, all schools with computers. All of our students and learners receive a computer that will be updated every 3 years, and we also provide maintenance service. We cannot allow any child to end up having a computer that does not work. Schools must be connected. We also created video conference rooms. We focused on infrastructure. And thanks to that, miracles occurred. We are not an IT company. This is not part of our job. Our job is to change practices, especially among teachers. We want to create and promote innovative practices within the educational system. Based on this first pillar, we also added other initiatives. We worked on platforms. So we have a number of platforms looking at education, content management, mathematics adaptation. We have a library, an online library. We have a library that brings together over 700 texts that are accessible from anyone in Uruguay with an ID and an internet connection. We also receive requests that help us feed into and add to this library. Equality, equity, democratization, and opportunities for all are our keywords. And this is how we managed to experience miracles. So all of that sounds very good, but we need to make sure that transformation occurs. And in order to do that, we work tirelessly on teachers' training. We work at different levels. We work on basic training. We work on training on site, and we also work on new projects within our center. Our center should be seen as a transformational unit. We found inspiration from the global learning network, as well as the new learning network. We worked a lot with them to develop skills, both digital skills and skills for the 21st century. This was a way for us to develop a learning framework. We were able to better understand what new technologies meant and to prepare for this insofar as teachers are concerned. We were also able to better use all those different infrastructure layers, all those programs, all those training sessions, all those study sessions, all those assessments. To start with, whenever I would give presentations, I focused my presentation on the CEBAL Foundation, and things have moved on. The CEBAL Foundation dedicated to educational research based on technology. So let me get back to this particular slide. I would like to talk to you about technologies, because this is very much in line with what Pablo was saying. Thanks to CEBAL, this innovation agency has made Uruguay, has put Uruguay in a position where they can have a dedicated team. Sometimes we have endless lists of suppliers that want to sell us technologies. But the problem is that until recently, we did not have dedicated teams who were able to assess the usefulness and efficiency of such technologies. We were unable to decide whether such technologies would be in a position to help us reach our educational targets. We didn't do everything right. We tended to make mistakes. We had budgetary limitations, and we had to adapt to the educational offer of our governments. Things were not always easy. And that brings me back to the risks that were highlighted by Pablo. The idea is not just to spend money endlessly. We had dozens of interviews with ministers and decision makers who felt that they didn't have the necessary infrastructure to provide for remote teaching, and they wanted to solve things overnight. I remember having 2 meetings with ministers who said, so, right, we are going to need to have everything we need in 2 days. And I would carefully answer, all right, well, we have dedicated 15 years to this, and things are moving slowly. And I realized that people were not quite realistic about what they wanted to do and what they could do. And I also realized that these people were not good planners. As we moved on, as we evolved, we developed a number of systems to identify evidence. As Reimer was saying, we don't always have access to the information that we need. I am personally in charge of CEBAL teachers' professional vocational training, and I have seen that we have used research that was not usable, that was obsolete. So we need new ways of working. We need new ways of assessing that type of project. These are very dynamic, very agile projects, and we need to come up with new ways of assessing them. And sometimes we feel that they are out of touch, that the university research is out of touch with that type of organization. Does that mean that I don't have any minute left? Okay, well, right. So that means that I will be here should you have any question, and I would like to thank you for your attention, for your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. And I'm sorry to cut you short, but the organizers have asked that we stick strictly to very quick follow-up question. You mentioned that you train teachers tirelessly, relentlessly, focused on teacher training. I was wondering, are you able to get sort of data or use digital technologies to improve that training? How is that training sort of shaped and iteratively improved? How do you know that the training you are providing is in fact working, and does technology play a role in that very, important aspect you mentioned?
Bien. Tenemos distintas maneras de darle seguimiento y evaluar el impacto en relación a.
So we have several ways of assessing the impact of our training, of our teacher training. So number one, there's big data. Number two, there's the platform that I was highlighting. And currently in Uruguay, we are in the process of developing a transformation of education. CEBAL came up with new technologies to carry out such trainings. This would be wide-ranging trainings that 60,000 teachers had to train them to get trained in a very short period of time. So we used analysis of big data to know who was making progress, whether there were hurdles and challenges, and sometimes we were put in a situation where we had to change modules to amend them. For example, we discovered that in module 3, 80% of students had bad grades, and the conclusion was that obviously there was a problem with the module. Out of the 60,000 teachers that were being trained, we were constantly updating our information and constantly updating and adjusting the content of training. And this is the reason why I wanted to mention this. This is a very dynamic approach. Having information in real time is very useful. And this is something that we've been working on at CEBAL. So not only do we have this macro vision of data that needs to be carried out hand in hand with practices as such, For us, it was very important to see what the role of tutors was, what the role of executives was. These were the people who were in a position to see whether teachers were able to translate their new knowledge into teaching. Oftentimes, we rely on well-rooted practices, and therefore amending such practices means changing a paradigm. And we need to change the way things are done in schools.
Thanks very much, Martin. Very interesting. I had a just quick follow-up question. We heard in Professor REIMERS' intervention the importance of also sort of listening to the stakeholders on the ground in education. And UNESCO's Futures of Education Commission called for sort of more dynamic communication with teachers, with students, and these new modes of communication that make some of this listening and hearing people in schools and classrooms possible. I was wondering, in Uruguay, how does that work? How are you leveraging, if at all, new technologies to sort of hear teachers, listen to their needs, and maybe use some of that input to shape their training? Is there a mechanism that exists like that, or perhaps one that is envisioned for the future? Over to you.
Sí, la retroalimentación con los docentes es permanente.
Indeed, we have a permanent feedback loop with teachers. There are constant assessments after each training, and teachers are in a position where they can come up with suggestions beyond what the administration comes up with. Teachers are the ones who say, this is what I need to be trained on. This is something that is done in a systematic way, and in February we have what we call the summer school. The summer school is a specific training that is developed based on what teachers requested. Now, on top of this, we also have more traditional training. But we do leave a lot of space to teachers for them to express what their needs are. And we have evidence to back this up. We can see that it's important to be trained to work with diversity, for diversity, to work in a constantly changing world, and to be able, for teachers to be able to work with technologies, as we said at the beginning of the symposium.
We're going to be hearing perspectives from Gregory, sharing us some perspectives from the Inter-American Development Bank. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks for Okay, sorry. Thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here, and I'm learning a lot from all of you. And I was going to share about an emerging topic, and I think exciting topic, if it's possible to get excited about education planning and management, as someone mentioned earlier, in education, which is centralized student and teacher digital assignment. And I'm going to talk about some of the work that we've done in Latin America on this topic, and some applications with teachers and students, and some other applications outside of student and teacher assignment with centralized mechanisms. Okay. So what's the current landscape? And I'll explain these two photos in a second, which kind of reflect the current landscape. What in most countries in Latin America, in many countries, not just in developing countries, parents and teachers typically apply directly either to schools, in the case of parents, or to school districts or municipalities or local governments, or sometimes directly to the Ministry of Education. And they have to navigate a fairly cumbersome, complex process that takes a lot of time. It's often opaque. It's not clear. The rules aren't always clear. In the case of parents, when they have to apply it, it often requires interviews or screening processes, school fees, long lines, camping overnight, getting a lot of documents. It's a very cumbersome and inefficient process, both for parents and for schools and for teachers and local administrators.
And so they invest, schools and local administrators invest excessive hours, and we've found in our work, in reviewing applications and assigning teachers and students to vacancies. And so I just want to show, these are two real pictures. The first is a photo in the Provincia de Buenos Aires that one of my former bosses took. And those, I mean, we don't know exactly what all of those papers are, but this is a very typical photo of a local level official that manages teacher assignment processes. They have to, somebody was telling me they saw a very similar situation in Pakistan, where local officials have to manage lots of files and paperwork to assign teachers. They have to consider every teacher. And this below is actually also, this is a picture, a photo of in Peru of families camping out to get a vacancy at the school the night before. Sometimes several nights, they have to wait in line and camp out to get a vacancy at popular and oversubscribed schools. And so this often leads to lots of inefficiencies, which I've already explained, but also inequalities. So families, especially disadvantaged or middle-class families, don't have the same access to high demand and high-performing schools. They often have to know someone, or they often have to have time to wait in lines and camp out. And disadvantaged schools also struggle to attract qualified teaching candidates and often have to resort to teaching hires. So just to give an example, in the region of Loreto and in Peru, which is the Amazon region, 83% of vacancies in that region in a recent teaching contest had no applicants. However, in other regions of the country, or in Lima, some schools have more than 30% of schools have more than 10 applicants. So there's a lot of applicant congestion, and this often leads to inefficiencies and inequities, or teacher sorting. That's the side. Okay. So the digital solution that some countries, and a growing number of countries in Latin America and other places as well, have designed centralized or coordinated mechanisms for assigning teachers and students to school. And what does this entail? Basically, here I have it as a front end and a back end. So in the front end, it's as simple as they don't have to go to the schools to apply, they apply online. Schools or school systems post the school vacancies with location and other key indicators for parents and for teachers when they're making that they need information that they need when they're going to make a decision. Teachers and parents, when they go online, they review the applications or the vacancies, they list their preferences and rank their preferences, and finally they submit and apply. Right? In the back end, there's an automated process, an algorithm that assigns teachers and students to schools considering their scores or government priorities. For example, in the case of families, if their siblings at the school, if the students have a disability, in some school systems, if the students are classified as vulnerable or disadvantaged, they have a priority for that vacancy. In the case of teachers, it's usually their scores on selection admission exams. An algorithm basically takes their preferences and these priorities and assigns the teachers and students to the vacancies in a very fair and transparent way. And finally, some of these systems integrate lottery numbers, especially in the case of students, for enrollment when there's a tiebreaker. So if two students have the same exact priorities and preferences, they receive randomly a lottery number that's fair, and the person with the higher lottery number gets the vacancies. So these policies have been introduced in some countries in Latin America, in Chile. In Peru, it's currently in Chile, it's already been scaled up nationally. In Peru, they're scaling it up. I think they have 5 regions now that use centralized admissions. Bogota, I didn't mention here, Palmira, which is another city in Colombia. And very recently, actually this week is the 2nd year that they're doing this in the city of Recife. There's also some other centralized systems, Rio and some other places that don't necessarily, the city of Buenos Aires, that don't necessarily use these exact rules, but they have a centralized mechanism. Now, the evidence on these systems shows that it improves the match between the parents and the teachers and their vacancies, which is very important, especially in the case of teachers. We want teachers to be happy and want to work, to choose where they can work. And this also generates significant cost savings. We can talk about this after if you're interested, but we've conducted some cost benefit analysis, and the systems are fairly cheap to set up, and they're very kind of low recurring costs, and they generate quite a bit of savings for the school systems, primarily related to time saved. However, there's a lot of inertia in these systems, so there's still persistent inequities. There's been some interesting analyses in Chile that shows that segregation really hasn't changed. Parents continue to apply to the same schools that they did before. And there's still significant teacher sorting in the countries that have adopted these systems, and high applicant density. So there's teachers and students apply to the same schools. I should also mention that there are centralized, there are few, but there's some centralized teacher assignment systems in Ecuador, Peru, the city of Sao Paulo, one state in Germany, and actually in France is another system that's there's kind of a growing number of studies about the centralized assignment here. Now, to kind of address some of these challenges, this is kind of one of the messages that I want to get across. When you have centralized assignments, not going to we're going to still continue to have some of the inequities and some of the inefficiencies. But what that allows you to do is within these platforms, you can they create opportunities to introduce low-cost interventions or low-cost solutions to reduce inefficiencies and narrow some of the gaps. And so here I'm just going to mention two that, and we have, these papers are available online, but the first are nudges or techniques from behavioral economics, very low-cost techniques from behavioral economics, and the other are new technologies. And so I'll just quickly explain both. The first are nudges, and we've done two types of nudges. One, which I don't show here, is nudging parents, especially disadvantaged parents. This is something we did in the state of Pernambuco in Brazil, to apply to full-time or full-day schools. We found that full-day schools, a lot of times low-income parents weren't applying to these schools. They didn't really understand the benefits of these schools. So we provided them with targeted information about the benefits of these schools so they could apply to them. And we were able to do this in the online platform in real time as they were applying for schools. Here in Peru and Ecuador, we developed two other interventions. One, and the objective was to attract certified teachers to hard-to-staff schools or to disadvantaged schools. And so in the case of Peru, we used two techniques from behavior. The first was where we focused on making extrinsic or monetary incentives more salient, more prominent on the platform. We found in our focus groups that often in Peru, they have significant monetary incentives to work in remote schools. You can earn up to 30% over your base salary if you work in a remote school. So we found that teachers often didn't know which schools had these incentives. So one thing that we did here is we just made this information available to teachers when they were choosing a school. We showed how many more soles you would make per month if you chose to work at this school. The second, we focused more on their altruistic motivations, why they became a teacher. And for example, what we made salient on the platform, we said, don't lose the opportunity to be a transformational teacher or to impact children's lives. And so we made these altruistic motivations more available to teachers when they were making decisions. And we found that both of these almost zero cost interventions had an impact. Teachers were more likely to consider and apply to hard-to-staff schools. The second, what we did in Ecuador was even more simple. We used the principle of order effects. I don't know if you've heard of this probably in political science. The order of the candidates on a ballot, on a voting ballot, makes a difference of who you vote for. We're more likely to choose, especially if we don't know the candidates, the first candidate on the ballot. And companies use this all the time on Amazon and Netflix. The first movie, the first product that we see, we're more likely to consider. So we did the same in Ecuador. These are all RCTs, so they're experiments. So we had control groups and we had different treatment arms. Above, we had 2 treatment arms and there was another control group. Here, our treatment arm, we just listed the hard-to-staff schools first. And so they had an icon that said, these are schools where you can have an impact on learning. And we found that this intervention, which was zero cost, it was one line of coding for the IT people in Ecuador, had an even larger impact than the experiment in Peru. I'm happy to talk more about these. And we just ran another large scale experiment with 150,000 teachers in Peru using a different technique, asking teachers to give advice to their peers on why maybe they should consider working in hard to staff schools, creating kind of a cognitive dissonance for them for when they made their decision on where they were going to work. Over the new technologies that we used were more related to the inefficiencies. So as I mentioned, a lot of teachers and students tend to apply to the same schools. And so what we did is we ran simulations during the application process, and we predicted which candidates or which families or teacher candidates were at risk for not getting a vacancy because they were applying to just oversubscribed schools. So we sent them an alert and we said, your application is a little bit risky. You may not get a vacancy. We suggest that you go back to the platform and add schools to your list or modify your application. And we found that this had a huge impact on the probability of parents getting a vacancy at a school and teachers getting a job. Because in Ecuador and Peru, in the centralized platforms, about 50% of teachers in each contest don't get jobs because they all apply to the same schools. And these last two are just our projects that we're doing now. Actually, in Recife, we developed a recommendation engine, kind of like they use on Netflix. When you choose your movies, we recommend you get other movie recommendations based on your choices. Well, we did something similar in Recife to try to assist parents to make better choices or to at least consider higher performing schools. We don't have evidence from that. Okay, I'm just going to mention this last slide. I also want to mention this because Martin was actually involved when Martin was the Minister of Education in Peru, and I think this is interesting because this was a technique that we used, a centralized digital system that we used in response to an emergency. So I think this was quite interesting. Right at the very beginning of the pandemic, the government realized that there was going to be a surge in applications or a surge of students leaving the private sector to enroll in public schools. So the government decided rather than subsidize the private schools, what we're going to do is we're going to create a system, an efficient mechanism to quickly absorb them in the public sector. So what the government did with the IDB's support is we introduced a centralized digital enrollment system to quickly enroll, and it was over 100,000 students, it was I think 135,000 students. These students in public schools, we didn't give them preferences. We enrolled them in the vacancy that was available that was closest to their home. So this was a quick response to an emergency that I don't remember, Martin, was like in May or June or just a couple months after the pandemic started, because private schools were either closed down and they didn't offer remote schooling. We're talking about private schools in middle class and lower income communities. And a lot of parents lost their jobs and they could no longer afford to continue paying tuition during the pandemic. And finally, the last one, I'll just finish here. We used, and this is a little bit more related to, I think, AI in kind of the future. We developed a policy to address teacher shortage in Chile. The initiative was to attract high-performing candidates into teaching. We worked with Elige Educar, an NGO in Chile, and the government. From high school. So high-performing high school students was also an RCT with about 80,000 students. And what we did is we had two arms in the experiment. One arm was a kind of an expensive tutoring program where humans would contact students, high school students, through WhatsApp using a script to try to engage with them and get them to consider maybe applying to be a teacher. What we tried to do is replicate the same experiment using a scripted chatbot to quickly scale up kind of a more expensive program in this experiment. And we found very positive effects of the human experiment, we found kind of positive, but not as significant in the scripted. However, what we want to do now is we want to try to find a more engaging technology. That's where we think maybe AI, kind of an AI bot that's more interactive, that would engage with the students, could be more effective. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Gregory. Very interesting model there. A quick question from me. Given all these advantages you just sort of documented, why is this practice, in your view, not more widespread? What are the sort of obstacles you're seeing to this, or pushback, or doubts that that countries are having?
I think it's political. In the case of Chile, which I used to live in Chile when we designed this reform, a group of parents that benefit from the status quo don't want the reform. So parents who know the principles, who can pass the screening tests, and sometimes in the case of Chile, they would ask for, I don't know, that the parents were married, baptism certificates, screening, the interviews. So some parents benefit from the status quo. So I think partly it has to do with that. In the case of students, in the case of teachers, local officials have some power when they allocate. It's probably not like a politically correct thing to say here, but it's true. And we found this in a lot of our work, is they have political power to allocate resources, and teachers are resources as well. And so taking away this power to actually be able to allocate, sometimes some of them try their best to do the best job they can in an equitable way. But they definitely lose power if everything goes online.
Very interesting. I'm also seeing shades of, criticism around it's a sort of algorithmic kind of placement, and you're putting an algorithm in a sort of very privileged position. I'm thinking of an educational example in the United States was people who are training to become physicians in the United States used to enter a sort of lottery to do their residency. It was very centralized, and they would send people out to these lotteries. This system existed for decades and decades, and then people began sort of protesting it on the grounds of individual liberties, that I should be able to, pick which residencies I apply to, and if I'm more competent, I should, be able to get more prestigious residencies. And I'm wondering, how do you answer some of those kind of critiques that this is an affront to my freedom and to my capabilities? That my strengths as a student should get me into the school rather than a sort of lottery.
That's an excellent question, and that actually gets to the core of it. I mean, these systems actually you have just as much choice. Doctors, parents, teachers, they can choose their vacancies. They go online and they can choose all the vacancies. The difference is, before, parents who were a little bit more advantaged, or teachers who maybe had contacts with principals, they would get the best vacancies, or families who knew the principal of the best school, they were more likely to get. So this takes away and evens the playing field. And so the challenge, this we found in research as well, is there's still an equity challenge, like Pablo mentioned in his presentation, of how can you equip more disadvantaged parents with more tools and information so they can actually take advantage of these systems. And so, of course, people who are more connected, what does it mean I have the competencies? The disadvantaged family, single mother who doesn't have time to wait in line and sleep overnight at school, also has the competencies, and also wants the best school for her child. So I think the idea is, I think this kind of affects people who are a little bit more connected and who benefit from the status quo. Just a similar answer as my first answer. So I think that is there's a political challenge, and that is precisely why lots of systems have kind of pushed back, or interested would have pushed back in introducing these, because you affect a lot of stakeholders, power particularly.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Gregory. Very interesting, and a concrete example of applying technology to improve educational equity. Amelie, you are up next, and I'm sorry that we're running a bit short on time. Never an enviable position to be sitting between an audience and their coffee break. So if you don't mind kind of being concise, thank you very much. Anyway, this is what it means to be staff. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for colleagues for leaving me a bit of time to share the experience from perhaps another angle. We've had a bit of context from Latin America in general. We had some experiences from the perspective of a bank, of CEBAL. So that was super instructive. But now from IIEP's perspective, I'll try to reflect a bit what takes place within a ministry. And of course, I encourage all colleagues represented from ministries here to also share their experience when we have a coffee break or a moment over the next few days. So we are here celebrating the 60th anniversary of IIEP, right? And one thing I always like to do is to read books and reports that have been prepared by our predecessors, some of them in the room. And what I enjoy most about these reports is to read, these last bits when they say, like, what are the next steps? What's the future of that specific topic? And every time I open these reports prepared by Françoise Caillot, by other colleagues, I would be fascinated because even like in the 70s, in the 80s, these colleagues had the intuition of what was to come. And remember, in these days, there was no Excel, there was no QGIS, there was nothing. I mean, basically, it was calculators, I guess, or mental calculus. And so to pick up a point that was mentioned by Mr. Reimer just previously, the planning that we could do was macro level by design. We couldn't use micro level data. I don't even think that at school level the data was collected eventually. So it was just impossible to do micro planning or crossing variables to make something like relevant at small area scale. And so now that we have access to this data, now that we have processing power, now that we have individual capacity to use this software, I mean, there's a huge potential ahead of us as planners. And so what we've been able to observe in our work in collaborations with ministries is that there's always this tension about, using old school methods or regular processes, something that, is already ingrained in the habits of a ministry. But there's also like this kind of, intuition to go and fall and be attracted by these shiny analysis, this big data, and this technology that often are in custody of consultancies and individual firms. And so ministries kind of trade independence, trade ownership for having access to that technology. So one of the questions that we get asked often is like, where do we start? How do we start? And like, how much will it cost? And so what we're trying to do from an IIEP perspective is to really empower ministries of education, empower institutions, strengthen the organization, the institution, and the individual capacities within the ministry to be able to use these technologies and to take advantage of this data, the data that is produced by the MS, of course, as we discussed, but also data that is produced and available elsewhere and produced by other people and beyond the education sector. And so what the objective basically of producing or preparing tools and training for ministries of education that really take advantage of the digital and technologies and the potential is really to make sure that the ministries can use these information, these softwares, this data, but also keep the ownership and keep the power of implementing or turning these results into implementable processes. So I'll use the rest of my time to show you how these digital technologies help us to do better, to do more, and to do differently also. I guess I also need a course. Okay, so doing better. One of the best examples I can give you about how we can do better with digital technologies is the use of geospatial data in educational planning. Doing better means using this, like the same concept that we used to use in the past, but changing the way that we are processing this data to get to more advanced results. One best example I can give you is the catchment areas, these buffers around schools that we used to design, as the crow flies, as we say. There's a paper available on the table if you want to read further. But now with information about school location, with road network, with the type of typology that we have, a topography we have in a country, we can actually calculate walking time to school. And so really have these weird looking, I guess, catchment areas, but that really show planners like what is the actual access to school when you want a child to walk there, to bike there, or to drive there. What we're working on right now, and this kind of also touches a point from our colleague from St. Kitts and Nevis this morning about decolonizing the school system, about decolonizing the school calendars. It's about looking at how can we make sure that our school calendars fit the context. How do we make sure that our children are not walking into floods to go to school when you know that there's a flooding season? How do you make sure that the school calendar actually is adapted to the crop calendar? And so this work can only take place at the micro level, using only free open source software or using only free open source data. And as for all the products I'm going to show, everything is open coded. The literature is in open access, also respecting as much as we can the UNESCO recommendation on open science. So everything that we do is replicable. Doing more, so going beyond what we've been doing so far in educational planning. What we are trying to harness also is the different approaches within the big umbrella of artificial intelligence to really go beyond the typical things that we could do, for example, with inspection reports. We have tons of inspection reports, but who in this room can actually read those and make sense of the information that is there? And so we've been working by a team of research with a team of researchers from academia to use natural language processing to not only, look at the words that were used within learning inspection reports, but make sense about, are the words used positively, negatively, and where are the schools located, so that we know that there are pockets of urban violence, or there are pockets of food insecurity. And so now, as planners, we can actually design interventions that are really targeted and that allocate resources optimally, let's say, or better than we could do before. And then doing differently. I think one thing that we recognize so far in this event already is that the world is very different right now than it was before. And so doing differently for us means also changing the way that we are thinking, changing the way that we are working. And so we try to work really with different disciplines, with people from completely outside the education sector, but also changing our working habits. That's why IIEP organized 2 hackathons. Hackathons are collaborative working sessions, 48 hours together, well, virtually together, trying to solve like real life issues, real life bottlenecks. And so that's one way that we change our approaches. Getting open also from to different knowledge systems, not only academic, those that we mentioned earlier, but really trying to think that this digital transformation will be inclusive or it will not be. We have to keep our minds open, because the people that we are serving are not from academia, are not from the ministry. And so we have to make sure that the education that we offer actually meets the expectations of these communities. So to conclude, I guess our worldview is that transforming educational planning with digital technologies will happen only if we also change the mindset, if we change the narrative, if we change the paradigm. And that's why we emphasize so much the collaboration, mutual aid, being engaged in communities at the local level that will use educational services, but also supporting the work of communities of practice. We work with, well, I mentioned open science and open standards, but also making sure that we use free open source software. Our first choice is always this, because we know that we can make sure that a majority of people in a ministry can be trained on a software if it's free and open source, that we know that they can debug their codes if there is a big community that uses this free open source software in the back. And so that's our mindset, right? We want everybody to be able to replicate what we do at very little cost and make sure that ministries can really take advantage of this transformation. And so I'll stop here. Perhaps also just concluding on the fact that basically I think that when we think about digital technology, we have to keep in mind that technology comes at very no tech or little tech, I guess, or very high tech. But nonetheless, we should always keep this wide range of opportunities in front of us. And so on this note, I'll stop here and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Emily. I think this is a reminder that a lot of the uses of technology can be for these things that are often overlooked or not discussed enough, that people think are banal, but are actually extremely important, like structuring the school calendar is of profound importance, but tends to not get a lot of attention. And when discussing education, people just tend to think about the teaching and learning exchange and not about all the fantastic ways these technologies and data can improve educational planning, educational calendars. a question for you, and this is something UNESCO has raised in a number of publications, especially the EdTech Tragedy publication, and that's that there's nothing natural about sort of datafying something or someone, turning schools into basically, ones and zeros, turning teachers into ones and zeros. There's nothing particularly natural about that. So it gives us a very, unique view of the world. Are we, in your experience, are we sometimes being blinded by the wrong things? Let me give you a sort of very personal example. And this comes from my own family. My sister got one of those watches. It tracks your steps that you take. Before my sister got this watch, she never cared at all how many steps she took. She's a healthy person, seems to, live a healthy lifestyle. But now that this thing is on her wrist and giving her this metric, she's obsessed with it. She's all the time looking at how many steps she has taken. And at the end of the day, at dinner table conversations and other things, she's announcing that this is how many steps I've taken, or she'll go walk around close to midnight to make sure that she gets over a certain step threshold. Yeah. And I was thinking that we often have these things in education, that just because we can track something, we give it sort of, heightened importance. Yeah. And, there is a risk of this datafication. Yeah. We all go to conferences. I dare a person to say that what you're talking about is not evidence-based, right? If you say something is simply ideas-based or ethically based, good luck sort of surviving that. Everything must be evidence-based. And by that, we mean quantitative data. Anyway, long question. Yeah. But
yeah, and actually, I'm sure that your sister actually tricks her watch by just like... No, you're right. No, you're absolutely right. And I think leading the data and evidence, I'm very sensible to the question you're asking. And one of the point that we're trying to keep in mind at IIEP, at least, if not beyond, is the fact that evidence has been a concept that has been completely skewed from its actual meaning. The markers that you're mentioning, the data that we have to be careful about, often has not been even identified by an actual ministry, right? It's the donors, well, I won't name anyone, but it's these organizations, or it's the global community that is putting pressure on ministries to track certain things. Whereas I would love if a ministry could really feel owning its decision about what they're going to track, right? And so what we're trying to transform also as we work and as we create these tools is to also change a bit this mindset about what is evidence, right? And one of the points I was super happy to hear earlier today is that evidence is also the experience of planners, is also the experience of parents and communities, is the knowledge, long-term historical knowledge about the seasons, about the landscape, and about how these I don't know, many of us watch this documentary about children having to cross like fields with hippos. This is nonsense. Children should never cross hippos when they go to school, right? This is so dangerous. And so evidence is, of course, hard data. It's also research findings, but it's also all this kind of human and experimental and historical and social, political, of course, economic variables that we need to take into account as planners. And so that's why also colleagues at IIEP, we often go in the areas meeting officers and planners like as far as we can from the capital of the city to really understand what are their expectations, what are their needs, how can we make this dialogue between them and the central level to make sure that we can really go ahead and design the interventions that will make sense to their community. And so this is a big issue for us. We try to also never say evidence-based. We try to say evidence-informed. And so that's, I guess, is like a little change that we can already start practicing when we go back to the office in a few days.
Well, I love the evidence-informed and this big question of what is evidence, what counts as evidence. And I like this sort of much enlarged view you mentioned. So to wrap up, we're going to get one sort of idea, concept from our panelists, just sort of 1 minute each. It may also be sort of centered around a single word. So something to kind of leave us with as we walk away. It's sort of something they'd like the audience to kind of keep in mind. So Pablo, again, kind of putting you on the spot, but one word, one concept you'd like to leave the audience with, no more than 1 minute. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. It's rather, it might sound obvious, but I think it's very important, and it's the nutshell, what I was trying to convey before, which is the use of technology in education should never be seen as an end in itself, but always a means to educational ends.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Pablo. Only over to you.
Yeah, thanks. I'll also use more than one word, but it's mutual aid. And I think that this idea brings us back to the concept that we should not, or we should actually all walk in the same direction. Of course, there are some costs, there are some private interests, but we should always keep in mind that the ministry is the institution in charge of education. And as such, we should protect ourselves from external pressures and go ahead and trying to tap on mutual aid and communities as much as we can. Thank you.
Thank you. Martin.
En español, una idea. Recordar que si la tecnología fue la respuesta, lo principal es
The most critical is to remember the questions.
I just want to reflect. I use my minute to reflect on what you said about your sister, because these kinds of systems, just like testing, standardized testing, aren't designed for, it's clearly not designed for people like your sister who are fit, who don't need the steps, who take care of themselves. They're designed for, just like testing or some of these digital systems are really designed to reduce equity and improve opportunities for the most disadvantaged. So I think just like the Apple Watch isn't designed necessarily for fit people, I think a lot of these systems are designed really to equalize or create more opportunities for people who don't have them.
Great. Thank you very much, Gregory. And I'll use this occasion to use one word from me, and that is, we're here celebrating this institution, and that is IIEP. For 60 years, this organization has been helping us understand how to use new technologies for educational planning and educational management. It's, as we can see, it's continuing this excellent mandate today, and I think all of us rely on this important institution for guidance in this area and understanding how to integrate these new technologies. So fantastic to make it to 60 years. We're looking forward to another 60 years. And again, sorry to be a bit over time, but I think we'll have a short moment for a coffee break. Thanks again, everybody.
Just quickly, yes, we have just a few minutes for a coffee break. Please come back downstairs at 4:15 when you hear the bell. You may wish, if you don't want to go that far, to cast your eye of the publications table just outside the door there. And if you're leaving the room, please leave your headsets by the door on the table and then get it back once you come back in. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Please take a seat. Thank you very much. We will now move on to our final session of the day. Please take a seat and we will start our final session of the day. Thank you.
Can we maybe ask someone?
We have a jacket at the front here. Is this anybody's jackets? Is it Mark? It's Mark. Thank you very much. Please take a seat. We would like to begin. Yeah, I can do it again, but I think what out there? Thank you very much, everybody. We now are going to start our final session of the day, and it is on thematic priority 2. How can educational planning and management help address the learning crisis? We welcome back our moderator for this section, His Excellency Dr. Justin Davis Valentin, Minister for Education of the Seychelles. Prior to his current position, Minister Valentin was Vice-Chancellor of the University of Seychelles, and he currently leads the education transformation agenda of the country. We are delighted to receive him here today.
So good afternoon once again, everybody, distinguished guests, excellencies, everybody, good afternoon. I'm happy to moderate this session this afternoon, the last session, and let's hope we have some fantastic time together. We have made a small discussions with the moderator, with the participant, the presenters, and we've agreed on one thing. So we'll allow each presenter to speak, and then we said, because we haven't seen much interaction from the floor, we believe that for this one, let's have some interactions from the floor. So what will happen is after each presentation, we will allow, depending on the time, we will allow 1 or 2 questions from the floor, so that we know it's approaching 5 p.m., so we don't want people to fall asleep at this time. So without further ado, I'm happy to introduce, ladies and gentlemen, the first presenter. So we will be talking about how can educational planning and management help address the learning crisis. But the question is there a crisis? We don't know. We'll see whether there's a crisis or not. So the first presenter on my list is Mr. Suguru Mitsunoya. I think I've got this one right. Thank you. So, and Mr. Mitsunoya is a technical cooperation team from the IIEP UNESCO. And very briefly, I will read, just to save time, one sentence from his bio, just to put you in the picture. So he has extensive international experience, having worked in both development and emergency contexts in Kenya and Syria, of course, Iraq, Pakistan, and Japan. Wow, he's an international guy, really an international person. So the floor is yours for you to do the first presentation. You have strictly 12 minutes. 12 minutes. Yes.
Thank you very much for your great introduction. Could you show my presentation? In my presentation, I will discuss 3 noteworthy activities undertaken by IIEP in the last 3 decades, all of which were designed to improve learning outcomes. And through this presentation, I aim to shed light on the evolution of IIEP's approaches and strategies and the variable insights that we gained from these activities in the past. Okay. All right, let me start with the SACMEC project. The SACMEC project was one of the first IIEP's attempts to shed light on the quality of education. The first round was implemented in 1995. It's amazing that about 30 years ago, IIEP and member countries were working together to generate a learning outcome and other educational outcome data to improve education and the policy planning and the results for children. Next one, please. And one of the key features of the SACMEC was that it was designed to help ministries take actions. So SACMEC was designed not only to generate learning outcome data, but also the seek education policy actions to improve learning outcomes and make solid policy recommendations. These characteristics of putting the data use at the heart of the assessment design resulted in policy recommendations incorporated in various educational reforms of the participating countries. For example, the SACMEC 1 survey triggered the initiation of a textbook development project for children from lower socioeconomic status in Zimbabwe and the development of national teaching and learning standards in Kenya. And in addition, SACMEC was a very practical program and which came with the various tools to support Ministry of Education to prioritize a number of recommendations. Next page, please. And the next project is ULAD project. And shortly following the SDG launch in 2015, IIEP underwent a notable shift in its mission from involvement in the primary data generation and research to new focus on the use of learning assessment data. As of today, millions of dollars has been spent in low-income and middle-income countries and also high-income countries to collect learning outcome data, but the use of them has been fairly limited. So in response to this reality, IIEP embarked this new the project to help support countries to identify bottlenecks that prevent countries to use learning assessment data. Next one, please. So the ULAD was implemented in 6 countries in Africa, where IIEP used both qualitative and quantitative analysis methods, and to evaluate aspects beyond student learning outcomes, but also important factors such as teachers and institutional frameworks and structures. And also to disaggregate results by the children's demographic characteristics such as sex, socioeconomic status, location, home languages, and disability status, and also to shed light on the causal mechanisms behind certain types of children are not learning. One of the key findings of the ULAD was that it's quite important to invest in the national vision and ownership of learning assessment, and also in institutional capacity to use learning assessment data. So that was the result, overall result we learned from the 6 countries. Next, please. And following that trend, a third category that I want to introduce is around the 3 themes: the individual capacity, institutional capacity, and capacity at the middle tier. Through training programs in the past, IIEP learned and changed its approach from individual focus to the system focus, because training for individual officials alone could not transform administrative structures and its efficiency and effectiveness. As you see that it's not me, it's the system. So the root cause of system inefficiencies has to be addressed, and in order for a sector to be more effective. Right, next one. These are the 3 projects that IIEP are engaging right now in Haiti, Niger, and Guyana. These projects center on enhancing the abilities of mid-tier and school levels to improve learning outcomes. Right. So what have we learned from the past in order to address the learning crisis through educational planning and management? An essential insight is that the government national vision and its capacity are pivotal. Both SACMEC and ULAD project underscored the necessity of government vision, ownership, and leadership, extending beyond assessment, implementation, and data collection. The lack of government ownership and capacity blocks ministries to use data and to maximize the potential, the value of the assessment project. Policy-oriented approach is critical to underpin the design of data analysis, coordinate essential functions within the ministry, and also establish sectoral priorities. Capacities at all levels are critical to address both financial and non-financial barriers within the education system. So this visualizes the data value chain. I won't go into detail. I just want to highlight that within the data value chain, there are different stages such as data collection, analysis, dissemination, use, and impact. And national leadership could mean many things, and one of which could be policy frameworks such as a national education assessment strategy. If we have a national such a strategy, all the stages of the data value chain can be guided to maximize the value of the data, because clear policy questions guide what kind of data should be collected, how data should be analyzed, and what kind of policy options should be considered. So such strategies shift focus naturally from data collection to data use. The second insight is that the tools and processes play essential role, and we need to invest, we need to refine, we have to innovate the new tools. And in order to effectively address learning crisis, there is a need to dive deeper into situation, who are not learning, causality, why they are not learning, and also the process for formulating policy responses. Right? That have to be informed by evidence, and that space have to be created more the participatory manner so that the all sort of evidence and insights and experience would be reflected to identify the right interventions for that problem in that country. And how part is about coming up with concrete plan that translate the vision that you have into actions. More specifically, a new sector analysis tools and methodologies are needed to address selected specific issues in education is needed. So the learning outcome is one of many education outcomes, but it's possible to generalize our approaches to pick and choose the issues we have, help government to identify who is having that problem, why that these children are having that problem, and how we address it. So that kind of investment is very much needed. It's critical to balance between the macro level planning and also the planning for specific challenges. The third insight is about middle tier and service delivery. Since 1970s, IIEP has recognized the importance of the middle tier, ensuring policy alignment in pursuit of common goals. IIEP has launched a multi-million-dollar multi-year project in several countries, and IIEP should generate tools, evaluate these programs, and generate evidence. And because the evidence and information, the effectiveness of the middle tier is very thin. We have a lot of evidence on many topics, but work of the middle tier is an area that we need to beef up our evidence and tools. IIEP also has embarked on a significant project dedicated to improve public finance management for education, which is critical. 2 minutes, yes. Which is critical because critical for the service delivery, like when the budget is blocked at the point of the system, they will not reach schools, classrooms, and teachers and students. Last one, please. So the last point I want to make is around the relevance and the flexible pathways. Education planning typically focuses on systems efficiency, effectiveness, and around national goals, assuming that the current education system provides relevant education for all. However, education should be considered within a broader framework, such an ecosystem, such as the ever-changing family dynamics, social networks, labor market, technologies, and economy. Both academic and social emotional skills needs to be mainstreamed in education in the modern context. Social emotional skills are proven to have positive impact on individual well-being, but also certain skills such as empathy, self-management, and various citizenship skills are indispensable for us to effectively live and work together in tackling global challenges, including climate change and conflict, which has risen in various regions across the world. We need to put the education relevance and the flexible pathways at the heart of the planning and management of education projects and activities. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Mr. Suguru. You have actually used 11 minutes, 47 seconds. Wonderful. Yeah. I think what you've just heard, basically, it looks like the contribution that IIEP has been making through research, work done in few countries, African countries, and of course, we've seen basically some lessons learned from these two studies, the SACMEC study, and of course, the ULAD study. So the floor now is open perhaps for more insight from the floor. Let's take questions from the floor. Wow, I told you the floor will be active. So we have the first person and then the second person at the back.
Thank you very much.
Just briefly state your name and so that we can know who you are.
Yeah. All right. My name is Michael. I am from IEPA, Institute for Educational Planning and Administration at the University of Cape Coast, Ghana. So thank you very much for the presentation. Sometimes as governments attempt to improve learning outcomes, some of the interventions, as you mentioned, and the processes, so the inputs and the processes that would lead to the expected learning outcome. Sometimes governments and political sponsors would spend a lot of time telling their story, their good story based on the inputs and the processes. I have done this, I have built this, I have provided this, without including much of the expected learning outcomes. So emphasis on inputs and processes, and more emphasis on inputs and processes, and less emphasis on outputs and the learning outcomes. So my question is, how do we shift, refocus, move away from telling the story based on outputs and processes to telling the story based on inputs and learning outcomes? At the end of the day, no matter how much you provide, if there is no reflection on learning outcomes, the work is not completed. But sometimes the story is told mainly around the inputs and then the processes.
Do we get an answer directly from you?
Yes.
Yeah, please. Thank you for your question.
Okay. Thank you very much for your question. I would say maybe four things. One is that it's quite important to have a rigorous M&E framework owned by the government. That's a usual mechanism for the government to be accountable for the result, not the input. And then I think there are several different approaches to support or create incentives for schools and teachers and the system to behave in a different way, which including the performance-based budgeting, so that these kind of the approaches will improve, have an impact on the results. And then the accountability is I think the key word here. I think it depends on the country. In some cases, even the very high officials and those people who are in charge of education may not be accountable. Like there is no strong mechanism to hold somebody accountable. And that might be a bigger issue than just the planning and management, but how we could improve the accountability mechanism in the country. The last part is I think it's quite important to have a wider partnership, like citizenship, like citizen-led organizations, the civil societies, so that we can jointly discuss results of educational inputs and also the outcomes that the national government is trying to promote and also achieve. So the participation of the wider community would be quite important.
Fantastic. So you're satisfied with the answer? He's smiling. Let's have a second question from the floor, please.
Thank you, Suguru. And I am trying to bring two strands together of IIP's work. Now, Suguru, you started with SACMEC, and I feel a bit sad because as far as I know, SACMEC is no longer running. Am I correct?
Correction, it is running.
It is running.
Yeah.
Ah.
In fact,
let's hear.
Yeah, no, SACMEC is running, and it has moved from IIP into the University of Botswana. In fact, last week, the SACMEC was giving out the result of the SACMEC 5 study, which was done.
Then already my optimism has improved. and I'm so delighted because I have been looking on the website for that, and it's since about 2013, we have not had SACMEC 4. And so now at last we have SACMEC 5.
Yeah.
Well, then I will, if you've got influence, make sure it's on the website and people like me can find it.
Possibly because they have added an E with the SACMEC.
That's all right. I
so
know that
keep searching, please.
I will keep searching. Now, the good news about SACMEC in the past, and I hope I will look for SACMEC 5, is that it did include data on my favorite topic, which is private tutoring, shadow education. I'm sitting next to Françoise Caillot, who was in charge of the fundamental series. Number 61 is about shadow education, and that is recognized as the first global study of the phenomenon. Now, this panel is about learning crisis. So therefore, two questions. Question one, does shadow education solve or exacerbate the learning crisis? Question two, what is IIP doing in this domain now?
Okay. You don't have to order question. The floor can also participate in the debate. If you feel that you are a bit entangling, please shout.
I mean, like your first question, I think we have the best professor in the world about shadow education. So I would like to listen to your view on whether shadow education, like what's the relationship between COVID learning. But what I can tell, it would be quite limited, but I'm pretty sure that it has the very diverse effect. So depending on the country, depending on the SE, the socioeconomic status, there are different access for shadow educations. So normally, I would think that those people are coming from the richer families who are more able to use the opportunities shadow education during the COVID. But there could be some other cases in different countries, which I don't know. And so I'd like to learn from you about the impact of shadow education. And in IIP current work, unfortunately, the shadow education has not been like the major topic, but it doesn't mean like we are not ignoring that. So like, as I mentioned, that the education have to be looked in a holistic system. A lot of planning activities are considered from the viewpoint of, say, the government, but the users of educations are coming from home, parents, children. So they make a decision how they want to engage with education. And then in that picture, shadow education exists. So I think it's quite important to have the viewpoint, two different viewpoints, looking at education from the provider side, but also regulation side, and also looking at the education from the user side. And that, I think it's quite important.
Thank you. It is possible that the shadow education is emerging, perhaps because of the crisis that we are talking about. So this is a point perhaps we will unpack a little bit further after we've listened to, if we have time, after we've listened perhaps to the three presentations. So now the floor is open for the second presenter. Let me bring my tool here. So I'm happy now to introduce Mr. Gomez. But first, let's give Mr. Nguru a fantastic round of applause. Thank you. Thank you. And let's introduce Mr. Andrew Gomez. And according to my notes, let me look at my notes. Mr. Gomez is the Director for Monitoring and Evaluation within the Ministry of Basic and Secondary Education in Gambia. And he holds a higher diploma in education from Gambia College, a bachelor in mathematics education from the University of Gambia, and of course, Masters in Public Sector Administration Management, again from Gambia. So let us hear what Mr. Gomez have to tell us this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Thank you very much, Honorable Minister. Excellencies, it's a pleasure being here this afternoon. We must thank IIP for inviting the Gambia to also add a word to one of the many voices coming from the field in this gathering. When His Excellency said in the morning that he is from Seychelles, and it's a small country, I was imagining, because he said 17 million. I was imagining a population of less than 2 million. So we are just a city in Seychelles. Thank you very much once more. Mine is very easy. I'm to give a reflection on the use of learning assessment data study that was conducted in the Gambia in collaboration with IIEP UNESCO, and also to highlight Gambia's efforts to improve learning outcomes, and also how the Gambia is addressing capacity gaps among staff. That means between teachers and the Ministry of Education staff, and also to provide a reflection on the plans related to improving learning outcomes through better planning and management. Looking at the topic at hand in this thematic area, which is looking at how planning and management can improve learning outcomes, I would want to look at a synopsis of a description of what effective education planning and management is in the context of education. I looked at it as a systematic process of goal setting, formulating sound managerial strategies, analyzing the education situation, and making decisions for improvement or enhancement of the quality of teaching and learning. And these would be looking at areas required to provide a foresight in addressing issues such as curriculum development or curriculum review, proper resource allocation, infrastructural development and management, performance management and capacity building of staff, monitoring and evaluation, and quality assurance, to name a few. It facilitates the identification of specific objectives and designing effective interventions for the achievement of desired learning outcomes. Therefore, it would be fair enough to look at the Gambian situation in terms of the existence of a crisis or not. In the Gambian context, access has been improved, as we can see, with a gross enrollment of 104.7 at LBS, of which 112.3 are female. That implies that over the years, we had issues of access through which planning and management addressed the issue of access, thus giving us these values. It implies that many more children in the Gambia are into the schools. But looking at the learning outcomes, there is an assessment that we call the National Assessment Test. And this assessment test requires a child to score a 40 score, at least to have marginal pass. But if you look at the learning outcomes here with the mean scores of English language, mathematics, and integrated studies, which are courses studied at lower basic, they are pretty low, although a little above the 40 requirement for the mean score for mathematics and English language, but you can see that integrated studies is far below. And the same thing applies at the lower basic. Therefore, we are saying these are not impressive scores, indicating the need to support education planning and management for the enhancement of learning outcomes, because this, to us as a country, is a crisis. Now, fortunately, in 2021, there was a study that was conducted, a qualitative study conducted with the Gambia and the IIEP. And the study was focused on 3 general light skill assessments, which are actually the National Assessment Test, which looks at assessing students in grades 3, 5, and 8. And grade 3, 5, and 8 alternates biannually, whilst grade 8 is assessed on an annual basis. And then we also have the early grade reading, which is done biannually too, for grades 1, 2, and 3, and also the early grade mathematics, which is also done biannually for grades 1, 2, and 3. Now, the results from this assessment, the findings from this study was very helpful to the Gambia because the study focused on the following. The study looked at the characteristics and the setting of the student assessment. How is the student assessment assessed? Looking at the level, looking at the curriculum, looking at the expected outcomes. It also looked at the roles and responsibilities of different actors who are coordinating and conducting this assessment at different levels, depending on their roles, the role of their offices. It also looked at the documented uses of learning assessment data, which was very helpful. And in the Gambia, learning assessment data is used in facilitating the school improvement planning. And in this school improvement planning is where you bring the school managers together, the students, the community members, especially the community representatives, and in some cases, the district representatives to participate in planning the future of these particular institutions. And it gives everybody a chance to participate by use of existing data in the school, qualitative or quantitative, to determine where the school is and where they want to be next in the next 3 years. Also, it is used for participatory performance monitoring, where the data from assessment is used to support the discussions between communities and also students, teachers as well, on the performance of their students. There is also a coordinating committee meeting, which is a platform where the minister and the senior management team members of the ministry also participate in looking at the different data in a particular region and trying to support the improvement. There is also a community scorecard where the community comes together with the teachers and the students and all those stakeholders in education to discuss the performance and grade the school as to how they are performing, looking at the availability of materials as well. The study also came up with very useful recommendations such as ensuring that the assessment policy is finalized, looking at sharing the data that we obtained from the assessment. It also looked at spelling out the clarity of roles of individual stakeholders in the process of the assessment, and so many others, and also recommended the Gambia's participation in regional assessments, which really paid dividend, because in 2023, this year, the Gambia participated in the assessment of minimum proficiency, which looked at the lower cadre of our education system, the lower primary for grade 3, and we are awaiting the results to determine how we are performing, so that we will also be able to report to SDG 4.1.1. There are also efforts that the country took in order to address some of these inherent challenges. Effort made to enhance the use of learning assessment data include the establishment of a performance management and evaluation directorate, where you have the monitoring and evaluation together with the assessment unit and the performance management unit as a directorate to be able to coordinate the assessment functions. There is also the establishment of a full-fledged assessment unit, as I said, which is being staffed so that the role of assessment, coordinating the assessment, dissemination of assessment data to various levels to the school level is conducted on time. We are also trying to review and finalize the assessment policy, which is based on, thank you very much, Honorable Minister. So basically, these are some of the efforts that the country is making. Maintaining a robust image system, ensuring the timely dissemination of data to the schools, and highlighting some of the efforts in improving learning outcomes. There's continuous professional development of teachers in place. We also ensure that the flexibility of appointment of teachers is done by regions, that is based on need. We also look at assessing teachers before appointing them so that the quality is ensured, and also provision of learning materials on time. That is, the funds are provided to the school account, and they will be able to decide as to what their needs are most in terms of dispensing. In addressing the gaps that are already existing, there is teacher training, that is training of head teachers and senior head teachers on the use of performance data analysis, and also sharing data, especially on attendance, their individual student performance, and keeping a database of student performance at the level of the school that is used to determine their areas of improvement that is required. We also have regional planning focal point that supports the schools in terms of doing the analysis. And also we have IT specialists who are supporting in the use of computer to facilitate this analysis. We are also supplying laptops and computers to some of the schools that they will be using for this data analysis. We also have training for the cluster monitors who are responsible for a particular cluster of school in a particular location, that they will also be supporting the teachers, because there's a training of trainers. They will go back to the clusters and support their teachers. We also support short and long-term courses for education staff, that is including the teachers and the staff at the Ministry of Basic and Secondary Education. One of the reflections, the Gambia is also strengthening focus on foundational learning, knowing that the performance of students in terms of the assessment that is conducted is not very impressive. We are focusing on foundational learning, especially with the new project, the Gambia Resilience, Inclusive Skills and Equity project is focusing on that. We are also working on the revision of the national education curriculum, which will inform the development of a teacher curriculum. We also intend to roll out the effective intervention, which is an after-school session program, which is used to support students, and results from the EGRA, the early grade reading, indicated that the effective intervention is really effective, and we are planning to roll it out to other schools in the country. We also encourage school collaboration so that they can share good practices in terms of what they are doing to improve in performance. We are participating, as I said, in international standardized assessments. We are hoping to have ample B in 2024, hopefully, after successfully conducting 2020B. I would want to end up with a quote, thank you, which says, "Quality education is our quest. Thus, the Gambia remains open to all partnerships in sharing good practices leading to improving learning outcomes." That's the quotation from my own Minister of Education. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Gomez. You will be penalized by for going 2 minutes overboard, but it was a fantastic presentation. There are a few comments from the chat window. One is, how can the presentation be made available to everybody? So perhaps this is a question. This is an easy one. Yeah. So later on. Yeah. So the answer is that will be circulated, and there will be a link on the web so that. Fantastic.
People on Zoom should receive the link in the chat, and for people in the room, there's a QR code on the wall that you can scan to access all the documents in all the languages.
Okay. Question answered. Then IIEP is being congratulated as well for the milestone anniversary. This also is a comment from the chat wall, chat window. I don't know whether you can pick one question from you want me to pick one question? Okay, there's a question for Suguru, but we'll keep that because he already answered question. Let's have a question from we have two questions, and this time we have two ladies. Okay, let us please begin by Madame in the second row.
Thank you so much. My name is Rukmini. I'm from Pratham in India. And I have two questions. One is that Gambia has been doing EGRA for quite a long time. One of the first countries to do EGRA, I think maybe 2008 or 9. So what are the trends over time that you see over this period? Is it going up, going down, getting better? And the second question I had is, and sometimes, and it may not be the case in your country, but the curriculum often is too hard. And the expectations that the children at different grades will be able to master that curriculum is sometimes, according to me at least, misaligned. And many times school systems do not have a catch-up program built in for children who are falling behind. So there are many things that the Gambia is doing for using the learning assessment data. But I saw teaching curriculum to be reformed, but maybe if there is a real effort to look at curriculum standards for especially early grades, and if there is something you can share on that, that would be very.
Okay, so let's take the second question. Yeah, okay. So Mr. Gomez will answer the first question, and then we'll pass on to.
Thank you very much. I think these are very, very touching questions, and how I hope we had time to share some of those details. And the most difficult thing is to give a teacher 10 or 15 minutes to say discuss. So basically, looking at the trends of the EGRA over time, EGRA started in 2013 in the Gambia, and it has been conducted up to 2016. And then due to certain issues internally, it could not be conducted over the period. But we have really seen some marked improvement in terms of the performance of students in early grade reading, which started very, very poorly. And then later, as a result of teacher training and other interventions that were introduced to support the early grade reading, as I'm saying, the focus is on foundational learning now, which resulted from the finding from the EGRA, and which is targeting grade 1, 2, and 3, and the lower, that's the lower primary school. We realized the EGRA is going to be better enhanced if we focus on this early grade reading. There are improvements, and how I wish we could share that data online. And that's one of the recommendations in our study with IIEP, that we should be sharing the data online so people can see what we're doing. The curriculum itself, we looked at the curriculum through monitoring at the field level, monitoring in the classroom, the use of monitoring tools. We realized that the coverage of the curriculum is affected. As you said, sometimes the curriculum is overloaded for the students, especially for the lower basic school. Currently, a curriculum review process is on, which will inform the development of the teaching curriculum so that we can establish at any given time how much have you thought as at what is expected. And basically, that would be helpful for us. And thank you for bringing up that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's have one more question before we move to the next one.
Yes, over here. Hi, thank you very much. My name is Selene. I work in the education department of the OECD, another international organization here based in Paris. And I'm actually very impressed with your presentation on the Gambia. The question about education quality monitoring and capacity building at the ministry level is actually a question that a lot of OECD member countries are struggling with. So I'll take up your from your ministry to share the good practices from the Gambia within our countries. I have a question very much about education, the link between education quality monitoring and school improvement support. And how do you make this link? How do you use the student assessment data to then inform professional development and school improvement initiatives? And even just very functionally within the ministry, is there an education quality monitoring unit? Is there a school support improvement unit? And how do these two work together? Thank you very much.
It's like if you worked in the Ministry of Education, the Gambia. Thank you very much. I think that's a very touching question as well. When you look at these assessment data, one of the functions of the assessment unit is to obtain the raw scores of all schools from the West African Examinations Council and conduct a thorough analysis by school. And these thematic areas are discussed with all managers at regional level, at cluster level, and at school level with head teachers, so that it can inform the required improvement of student performance based on the results that has been presented by the assessment. So basically, it reaches the school, and it also informs the school improvement planning, because instead of taking the descending approach of planning, we are taking the ascending approach. The schools would plan further to the regions and then move to headquarters. It does not miss the political intention of the administrative or government or the like, but it is very much informative when it starts from there. But we give them the relevant information to inform the planning, and they plan supervised, right, supported, and then that information goes up there. So basically, that's what we do.
Thank you, Mr. Gomez. And parallel to this answer, there is a question from a certain Sarah on the chat wall. She is inquiring how these studies relates to childhood development and also the monitoring of learning progress in school. Can you briefly say something about that, please?
Yeah, briefly it does. If you look at the recommendations were based on the findings of the study. The recommendations were based on the findings of the study. And basically, we will look at the recommendations in terms of this, the need for sharing findings from assessments. It's all meant to support children. And this can lead to a sort of following of the child's performance, trying to trace the child along the grades based on the performance in maybe NAT, or maybe that's the national assessment, or maybe the EGRA, or maybe the early grade mathematics. You will be able to determine the performance of the child at that level. And you'll be able to support that child along the upper grades to see that this child has a vacuum in this which needs to be filled. And then you follow up that child. By the time the child gets to grade 9, we expect to know that the gaps are closed or not, because you also have the national assessment test at grade 8. We're planning to have another in grade 11. That means we are trying to track those children to be able to know that the gaps they have has been closed.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Gomez. Ladies and gentlemen, you will realize and you will agree with me that the ULAD study has been, another significant study of IIEP. And maybe in the corridor, I will have a conversation with the IIEP team to ask them, why is it that Seychelles was not introduced to this study? Because it's a very good study, which I believe many countries would have benefited from that. So thank you everybody for your questions. Mr. Gomez, thank you. Another round of applause, please, for this fantastic presentation. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we are moving on to the last presentation in this series by Madam Sylvia Skutmelkesh. Yeah, she trained me during the discussion how to say that. Yeah. Madam Sylvia is an independent researcher, a former director of the Mexican National Institute of Educational Evaluation, of course, in Mexico. And she is a sociologist with a master's degree in educational research and development from the Universidad, another university, of course, in Mexico. Madam, the mic is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very, very happy to be here, and I want to congratulate IIEP on this 60th anniversary. I'm going to speak in Spanish, so if you want to put on your...
Right. Thank you so much. I'm going to talk about planning for learning quality. This is the subject I'd like to get into detail. I would like to say that 30 years ago, I participated with IIP in a study on primary education. And there were two things that really struck me at that point of time. First of all, we saw that there was a primary school certificate had a different meaning depending on the zone where the school was. So there were inequalities within learning. And then I also learned that a good school in a poor region could have better results than bad schools in good regions. So this is the results we got. That we haven't been doing any evaluation of education, and when we carried out the study, we realized that all these terrible inequalities surfaced. Now, I wanted to start my presentation by talking about the following subject. Learning is the very purpose of education. That seems obvious, but we tend to forget it in many countries, And why is it the purpose itself of education? Education basically produces learning. That's the mechanism that basically gives everyone a level playing field. It gives individuals the possibility to live in a dignified way, and it's a basic human right. It's also a condition for well-being and a factor for societal development. And this is why learning is something that helps us all achieve all this. And in order to have learning, in order to ensure that learning happens, we really must make sure that certain factors are met. And because learning is the center of many factors. The SDG 4 prioritizes learning, and IIEP is addressing the learning crisis in priority 2. And that's the number one priority, in fact, for IIEP. And this is something that deserves to be underlined. Bridging learning inequality is the major subject that I'd like to look into. This has not been a priority for educational planners in most countries, and I'm just generally speaking. Of course, there are exceptions to this rule, but it wasn't the priority for many countries. And why so? Because the main concern, the main focus of planners is basically to improve averages and not reduce gaps or differences. We know that learning is correlated with the geographical region, culture, mother tongue, migration, disability, and lack of capacities. And we've got inequalities in learning, and this is a basic violation of human rights. So we really must ensure that this becomes a major priority concern for planners. And this is my main message. You need to basically level down the inequalities. It has to be a priority as an educational planner. The future of education depends on the capacity to make sure that all children, old, young girls, boys have access to education and the same opportunities. And this is the main objective. Now, how can we plan to ensure equality? Now, planning has had successes. It has guaranteed many advantages, but it hasn't been successful in reducing poverty. Now, of course, there are exceptions, but I'm again talking in general terms. The possibilities are not the same for all children who go to school. The poorest, in fact, start with a major disadvantage, and that is exacerbated by learning conditions in the poor regions. So there are challenges for planners. First of all, you need to ensure that you've got the prerequisites for learning. There are prerequisites because everyone should be at the same level, so we need to have the adequate conditions. It's also important to have equity indicators on board. We give averages, and the equity indicators must tell us what the differences are. You really must make sure that the society is aware of not just the major development indicators, but also indicators measuring equality. And you really need to bridge these gaps. And this is a way to measure the progress achieved by bridging the gaps. So we'll have to see what are the conditions of poverty, the conditions of poverty of both demand and supply. We should, match this and see how this can have an impact on poor learning. Very often, when there is poverty in demand, what happens is the poor become poor and the rich become even more rich. So this is the definition of Merton, and this also happens in the field of education. So there are three key things that I'd like to mention in order to ensure equity in learning. First of all, you need to fight the causes. Then we need to use test results. And thirdly, we also need to decentralize planning. Now, in order to fight against the reasons, the causes, you have to look at the educational research in the education that will explain why there are inequalities. And I'm going to very quickly talk about certain causes that tell us that there is a problem. First of all, you have different unequal distribution of capacities and to put pressure on the system for learning. Secondly, you've got funding mechanisms. We are not providing more funding to people who need the most. In fact, in certain countries, it's the opposite. That's happening. There's a geographical segmentation that does not allow for diversity. And we know that diversity in schools is actually being brought down, which is already at a rock bottom level. And there's also concern by political leaders to have short-term immediate results, especially in the field of learning. These results take a lot of time to appear in poorer sections. So these policies need to be given time, and it's really not possible to have immediate short-term results. Moreover, it's actually cheaper to improve learning when you are dealing with a privileged population. And this is really not the way to actually bridge gaps. Very often, people who take decisions are satisfied by ensuring access, and they really are not bothered about learning. So we've got universal models, programs, organizations, and that are of diverse nature. And there's also a lack of relevance, as my colleague said. The teacher allocation is very unequal. There are young teachers going to difficult areas and vice versa. And these inconveniences just keep adding up. We also know that in schools, we have less recourse to methodology of inclusion. There is bullying against the poor, not just inside the school, but also outside the school. And school planning is really not talking to authorities, dealing with training, dealing with pedagogy and learning. And we've actually seen that this is a major problem when the previous speaker spoke about the subject. Now, this is the first element. You also have an underutilization of test results. We know that there is a learning crisis, we can say it. And it's thanks to this test that we know who are learning the least. We have some kind of measure of the gap. We can see the zones where there are problems by social sector, and we have these results and we can see if these gaps are narrowing or widening. So we're not going to talk about the barriers because we know that very often we do not use the test results. And lastly, we need to make sure that planning is decentralized. We spoke about this during the day. We need to plan closer to the field, especially like capacity building. Must use test results for better planning. In Gambia, micro-planning is done with geolocalization technology, and we are also planning the requisites and implement conditions that are conducive to learning. Now, with regard to the future of planning, the major challenge is to make sure that everyone is at the same level, bridge the gaps, bring together everyone so that everyone has a level playing field and we can do away with inequalities. This should be a national priority, and we really must prioritize equality. No one should be left on the side. And this means that we really need to basically focus on the bottom of the pyramid. I've finished. Thank you so much.
Wow, thank you, Madam Sylvia. When you listen to her presentation, it moved from crisis to like education is in a mess. So I think you really use your sociologist hat in order to unpack the discussion about learning crisis. So I believe several people in the room will have questions for you. Yeah. So do we have questions from the floor? We have one from the gentleman in front and another one from the back. Yes, Monsieur.
Thank you very much. And that was a very brilliant presentation. Yeah. Indeed, the presentations have been really very, very on top. I am just asking my question from the last point that you raised. Raising the floor and leveling the gaps. How do we do it in our context? We have the rural enclaves having the greater challenges. And those are the areas that often bring out the realities of the context in terms of the educational crisis. How do we level the grounds for the rural folks? Because apart from the poor teachers that they have, because teachers don't want to go there, they feel that the amenities there do not support them in their livelihoods, and therefore they do not want to go. The resources there, apart from the teachers, are also inadequate. The structures that the learners are using to learn, in fact, there are certain cases where students learn under trees. How do we deal with these things so that we'll be able to level the floor for everybody? Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's a very important question, a very difficult one to answer because it involves too many factors. But I do think that you're very right. Teachers are central to this issue, and the fact that teachers do not want to go to the poor areas I think is a fact in many of our countries. But I think that one of the things that we have to do is incentives for teachers. And we have to give more incentives to those that go to the remote areas. And I also believe that there is like a life cycle of the teachers. And in the beginning of their life cycle, before they are married, before they have children, when they have a lot of enthusiasm because they just left their school and they have this altruism and this motivation to work, that is when they should be able to go to these places and of course receive the support that they need because they are recent graduates and they need support. So the two things are very important. And after 3 years of giving their time to the most remote areas, perhaps the greatest incentive is to let them choose where they want to work after the first 3 years of their career. That is one way of doing it. And the other thing is that I think we have to realize that there is an enormous diversity, and that is why we have to plan at the local level to be able to respond to the local contexts.
So thanks for your presentation. They were all very interesting. I have a question for Sylvia. You mentioned that weighted funding mechanisms or equity funding mechanisms, and there's a good amount of evidence that weighted funding combined with some kind of quality assurance or support for the most vulnerable schools can have an impact in narrowing learning gaps. What do you think some of the political challenges of introducing, because for me it seems like has always seemed kind of like a no-brainer, right? That we should be giving more resources to more disadvantaged schools because students are more costly to educate. They need more support, more better teachers, more. What do you think some of the, in your experience, maybe in Latin America, what do you think some of the political challenges are for introducing some of these equity financing mechanisms?
I think the most important one is the fact that the poor have no voice in putting pressure on the system. So it isn't important for politicians to reply or to respond to their needs. And another thing that I believe is that also the people that live in poverty sectors have no idea of what their right to learning is, not only the right to education, to have access to school, but what that means quality-wise, or what that means in learning terms. So this is another reason why they don't put pressure on the system, because they are very happy with, at least in my country, they are very happy with what they are receiving because the school is there, the teachers are there, and it's quite recent, so they can make the comparison with how it was before. So I think that also with lifelong learning education, we have to reach these sectors to tell them about their rights and their rights to quality education.
The fact that your presentation was in Spanish, I believe perhaps some people, when looking and listening to the translation, they might have missed a few things. But you were focusing a lot on inequality. Can you perhaps in 50 seconds tell the audience what you were really saying about this whole issue of inequality in education, please?
Well, actually, I was worried about equity, more than inequality, because equity has to do with recognizing that there are there's a diversity in access and in learning, and that you have to deal with this diversity according to what each one of these sectors or these people need, and that's equity. So my main point is we have to make equity, learning equity, a priority in educational planning, and that means closing the gaps as one of the main indicators of educational progress.
Thank you. Let me start again. There were some focus questions that have been prepared for the panel. I believe it should not only for the panel, but perhaps for us to engage with these questions. One such question is, let me see, in the context of learning equity, how can educational planning and management address disparities in access to quality education and learning opportunities? Shall I reread the question or it's clear? Anybody, please feel free to engage with this question. Yeah. because we all have a voice about this whole topic. Planning so that we resolve this learning crisis. If it was in a quiz, I would say pass. Let's listen to Monsieur, please. Yes, for
I have a question about timescales and the capacity of humans and systems to respond to different timescales. Let me explain. The timescales involved in changing access are very different than the timescales involved in changing learning outcomes. I won't say that the timescales of learning outcomes are as slow as the timescales of climate change, but I do know, having spent some time looking about it, that one of the reasons humans have difficulty in introducing the changes we need to introduce to address climate change is because we don't think in those timescales. And so when you said politicians are more likely to paint schools or improve schools or deliver computers, they are operating in the timescales that most of us can function. So I have heard presidents or ministers say things that are absurd. I would like during my term or within the next 10 years to make my country, which is in the bottom third of the distribution of countries in PISA, one of the top thirds. It just shows that they can't operate. They can't understand the time scale. So what do we do with that? I agree that focusing on learning is essential. I agree that imperfect as any measure of learning is, it's good to have some measures, but I don't know what to do with our capacity as humans to assimilate the timescales that are involved in transforming the quality of a system understood as that which assessments of learning can register.
Another very difficult question to answer. Yes, I think it really has to do with values. No? A real value education gives you the long-term scope, no, of the effects of your behavior or your decisions. No? For example, if you think about environmental issues, no, you have to think not only of the people that are living right now, but of those that are living in the next generations. And for that, you need a value education. You need to have and with high cognitive demands, actually, no? So I think that we have to invest in that type of education, values education in our school system to be able to think in the long term. But referring to educational systems, what we need, I think, are, in Spanish, we call them políticas de Estado, state policies that go beyond administrations, no? And that has to do with the power of civil society to sustain a policy. No? So we need policies that go beyond administrations, that are sustained by a strong civil society that can actually put pressure on the system not to abandon the very important goals. That would be my answer, which is very simple. It doesn't answer a complex question.
On your question on how planning and management can address inequalities, I want to believe we have, in my country, for example, we conduct a census every 10 years. And in each of these 10 years, we collect information about almost everybody in the whole country. And of course, you should be able to establish at the time, who are those who are lack of teaching learning materials? Who are those lack of schools? Who are those in terms of education in the lower care of maybe the education quintile? Of course, you have the economic quintiles of people, the poverty levels, and they're designated by areas, and you'll be able to tell. In most cases, those in the disadvantaged areas seem to be performing very poorly in most of the areas because they lack certain incentives, they lack certain basic rights that they are supposed to be provided with for education. And constitutionally, you are saying everybody has a right to education, so that right should be accorded to everybody. So on the basis of what is available in the areas, government should be able to determine who needs help in terms of education infrastructure, in terms of teachers in that area, and addressing those issues is trying to merge the inequalities. Of course, it's trying to bring the disadvantage to a particular level, and also not depriving the advantage, but also trying to align them by giving more to the more disadvantaged and try to strike the equilibrium. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. And I think when we say plan, education plan, that has several components in it. The one component is the operation part of it, operational plan, how to do things. But the other side, even bigger one, is about the vision development and sharing and building. So I see the value of education plan or policy. I think that the term plan might be confusing because different people use different ways, and then even us use the plan for different meaning in different occasions. But I think when we have the sectorally owned plan discussed in a very participatory manner, owned by the institution, that has a different timescale than individuals, beyond maybe the leadership given to the ministry given time or individuals. So I see the value of education plan that will kind of stand against the different time spans of different actors in education.
I've been given with that miserably. I've been given the instruction to wrap up, but just to do justice for those people online, because we want them to come back tomorrow, let me take one, whether the panel can deal with that. The question is, in Latin America, we have 800 indigenous people, around 45 million. How can we ensure that education is based on the world view and does not generate interference? So I am assuming that these figures are correct. So does anyone perhaps have? Okay, the sociologists will definitely answer that.
Thank you very much. Well, one aspect of equity has to do with what we call epistemic justice. And epistemic justice has to do with precisely including the different worldviews within the curriculum, within the classroom, and in dialogue with traditional, scientific, and Western ways of thinking. No? And this is something that is not done in Latin America, and something that we have to do, because we do have an enormous number, not only of indigenous peoples, but of indigenous cultures and groups. And epistemic justice has not been carried out.
Ladies and gentlemen, I believe Madam Sylvia deserves a very big round of applause. It has been a very stimulating last session. Of course, the whole morning until now, it has been very stimulating. And I know you are coming back again tomorrow for more engagement. But this, and I mean, is the cocktail today? No, because I would have said we end on a very good note to carry on the conversation into the cocktail. But please, tomorrow, when you are having some bites, yeah, you will get the chance to engage further with the various presenters. And not only these three, but of course, the one in the morning and also in the early afternoon. My duty is officially over at this stage, so I hand back the micro to.
Thank you. And just to confirm 100% that the cocktail is tomorrow, not this evening. Well, thank you to this panel, and let us also send a warm thank you to the interpreters who have done excellent work. We are over the moon that so many people could join us here in Paris and online. And we continue, of course, with a full program celebrating 60 years of IIEP and continuing our discussions on the future of educational planning. Please don't forget, if you are not joining us tomorrow, to complete our post-event survey. That will be posted in the chat, or it's available on the QR codes on the posters. We would really like to hear from you about how you found this event. And one final reminder that we will be leaving at 6 o'clock sharp for the Global Teacher Prize at UNESCO headquarters. We will be traveling as a group via public transport, so it'd be great if we see you there. And there is also a shuttle running, but with limited spaces. If you are joining us tomorrow, please keep hold of your badge. And if not, please return the badge to us at reception. And please don't forget to leave your headsets here in the room because we would love to have them tomorrow. And we are most excited to see you there tomorrow. Thank you. Enjoy the Global Teacher Prize. Have a good evening.